breathe slowly, just like this. You're doing well. Keep going. It's almost here.
Push Dave away. That's some mother. Slow. Well, you're doing good. Just a little more.
Oh, look at that little face. So peaceful. Such a beautiful baby. You did wonderful. Welcome to the world, little one.
In the Middle Ages, life began not in hospitals, but in small wooden homes, warmed by fire and prayer. When a woman went into labor, a messenger would run through the fields or along dirt roads, searching for the midwife who carried knowledge older than any book. She was the wise woman, a healer, a guide, and for many, the thin line between survival and tragedy. Inside, the birthing chamber transformed, linens boiled, herbs crushed, candles lit, and prayers whispered for mother and child. No men were permitted inside. Birth belonged to the women of the village, to their hands, their courage, and their inherited wisdom. Pain came without mercy, but so did the community. Neighbors, mothers, sisters, and midwives worked together as a circle of survival. In that moment, when the infant cried, the entire house exhaled. A new voice had entered the world, fragile, sacred, uncertain. Yet birth in the medieval world was never without fear. For every child who survived, many did not. For every mother who held her infant, another was mourned. At first glance, a medieval village sunrise appears modest in its rhythms, yet every small movement reveals a world carefully built on necessity and ritual. Dawn breaks across a horizon softened by distant forests, and small timber-framed cottages push thin ribbons of smoke from their chimneys as hearth fires are rekindled for the day. The scent of damp earth lingers after a night of cooling fog, and the narrow dirt paths between homes turn slowly to mud under the feet of livestock being led to pasture. Villagers wake not with alarms, but with the instinctive understanding that daylight is the most valuable currency one can possess. A medieval day allows no idle luxury. Chickens scatter across the yards to forage for beetles, while pigs snort through piles of discarded vegetable peels. Oxen, reluctant but obedient, are led toward the fields by the older boys of the family who have learned their tasks long before reaching adulthood. In the distance, the muffled sound of a church bell marks the canonical hours, reminding the faithful that life's tempo is tied not only to agriculture, but also to devotion. In the tiny gardens surrounding each home, women tend to herbs, thyme, rue, rosemary, and savory, whose uses blur the line between culinary flavor and household medicine. Indoors, the warmth of the hearth is being stoked for bread making, gruel boiling, or the heating of water for washing linens. Medieval life, for most villagers, is an unending series of duties: spinning wool, mending clothing, repairing tools, tending to animals, gathering firewood, and preparing for the season's next trial. Yet despite the relentlessness, there is a communal rhythm. No family exists alone, for survival depends on neighbors, kin, and shared knowledge. Children, barefoot and unself-conscious, chase each other across the edges of fields, some assisting with chores not out of punishment, but out of common expectation. Even the youngest have tasks: carrying firewood, feeding chickens, filling buckets. Childhood is short here, not because affection lacks, but because life demands participation. The architecture of the village, thatch roofs, wattle and daub walls, wooden shutters, and earth floors, tells a story of local materials and practical constraints. The wealthiest homes boast a second story and perhaps glazed windows, while the poorest are little more than huts with smoke holes. A communal well sits near the center of the settlement, and women gather to draw water, gossip, and exchange news. Information travels not by formal decree, but through conversation: who has fallen ill, which harvest looks poor, Which family expects a new child in the coming weeks? As the day unfolds, the village begins to hum with human voices. Men gather to discuss the state of the fields or livestock contracts. Young women churn butter, weave cloth, or tend infants. Old women, repositories of memory and wisdom, observe quietly, only advising when necessary, for their counsel is not given lightly. In the agricultural season, fields demand the greatest attention. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye must be planted, weeded, or harvested depending on the month. Failure in these tasks doesn't mean inconvenience, it means hunger. Above all this looms the church, both literally and symbolically. Its stone walls stand sturdier than any domestic dwelling, and its bell sets the rhythm of prayer and labor. The churchyard, with its modest graves, reminds villagers daily of life's fragility. Religion permeates every part of existence: when to marry, when to plant, how to treat illness, how to mark birth, and how to accept death. The sensory world is rich: the creaking of carts, the snorting of livestock, the chopping of wood, and the murmur of prayer. The smell of smoke clings to clothing, mingling with the scent of hay, herbs, sweat, and sour ale. Medieval people are no strangers to hardship, yet their lives are not devoid of celebration. Feast days, weddings, baptisms, and fairs punctuate the year, offering brief reprieve from unending toil. It is within this tapestry of labor, faith, and community that childbirth takes place. Babies are not born in sterile rooms with polished metal tools, but in the center of domestic life, behind wooden shutters, by the heat of the hearth, attended by familiar women whose voices and hands have guided countless births before. The expectant mother knows she is not merely performing a private act, but participating in the continuation of the village itself. Thus, when the first cries of labor echo through a cottage, the village is not indifferent, for in a world where survival is an uncertain gamble and the future is never guaranteed, the coming of a child represents both hope and vulnerability. This is the setting into which mothers bring forth life, a world defined by its intimacy, its danger, and its unspoken understanding that every new birth is a negotiation with fate. In medieval society, childbirth was not simply a biological event. It was a cornerstone of social continuity and the mechanism through which families sustained both their labor force and their lineage. For noble families, the birth of an heir carried implications for property, alliances, and political survival. For common villagers, the arrival of a child ensured the continuation of household labor, care in old age, and the strengthening of communal bonds. Across all classes, childbirth was an event saturated with hope and burdened with expectation. Medieval families, both peasant and noble, existed in environments where mortality was a constant presence. Disease, famine, war, and accident could strip a household of its members with little warning. As a result, many marriages produced numerous pregnancies, not because medieval people were ignorant of the difficulties pregnancy entailed, but because survival demanded redundancy. Children were the means through which a family counterbalanced the losses that the world inevitably inflicted. For peasants, children contributed to the household economy from early ages. Boys herded animals, plowed fields, or chopped wood. Girls spun thread, ground grain, hauled water, and learned the domestic skills essential to maintaining a home. These were not trivial tasks. They were the lifeblood of subsistence. Without a steady generation of offspring to perform them, the household risked collapse. Families without children encountered profound vulnerability, particularly in rural settings where communal life was tightly interdependent. For the nobility, the stakes were different but equally high. Lineage served as the mechanism through which lands, titles, and privileges were transferred. A noble family without offspring faced extinction of its name and fragmentation of its estates, often absorbed by rival families or the crown. Thus, The birth of sons, heirs capable of perpetuating lineage, was celebrated with particular enthusiasm. The birth of daughters, too, carried political weight, for they served as instruments of alliance, cementing ties through marriage and diplomacy. Childbirth in such households was attended by physicians and clerics, and elaborate rituals ensured legitimacy, for questions of paternity and inheritance invited conflict. Yet the importance of childbirth extended beyond familial strategy. At the community level, each newborn represented a contribution to the village's collective resilience. More children meant more hands for harvest, more continuity in craftsmanship, more defenders in wartime, and more participants in religious observance. A village with few births faced demographic stagnation and potential decline, for attrition through disease and hardship would outpace renewal. Religion further elevated the stakes. In a deeply Christian society, childbirth was intertwined with spiritual destiny. The immortal soul, believed to be bestowed at conception, required baptism shortly after birth to secure salvation. This urgency meant that birth was followed quickly by ritual. The community gathered to witness the entry of a new soul into both earthly and divine order. Death before baptism was one of the deepest fears, not only because of emotional grief, but because of theological uncertainty regarding the child's eternal fate. Women's identities were deeply shaped by childbirth as well. For many women, particularly in peasant communities, reproductive capacity was a central aspect of social value. A wife who bore children secured her place in her husband's household and his lineage. A woman unable to conceive faced suspicion, pity, or marginalization, for childlessness threatened the household's continuity. Yet motherhood also afforded women a degree of authority. Mothers, midwives, and elder women became custodians of knowledge that men did not possess, and in the birthing room, male authority often vanished entirely. The communal nature of medieval childbirth meant that the village itself became witness and participant in the event. Women gathered not only to assist, but to relieve the isolation of the mother, offering stories, prayers, and encouragement. This shared female space served as an arena of cultural transmission, where techniques, remedies, and beliefs were passed through generations. Birth thus became a conduit through which ancestral knowledge survived, adapted, and persisted. Above all, childbirth symbolized renewal. In a world where longevity was uncertain and old age rare, the birth of a child reaffirmed that life, despite its precarious, would continue. The cries of an infant cut through the harsh realities of medieval existence and reminded the community that their efforts were not in vain. A child's arrival justified the toil of sowing grain, the labor of mending walls, the prayers uttered in church, and the sacrifices made to withstand hardship. Thus, childbirth in the medieval world mattered not only because it brought forth individuals, but because it sustained lineages, households, economies, spiritual continuity, and the village itself. It was the mechanism through which medieval people negotiated both survival and meaning in a world without safety nets or guarantees. Medieval childbirth unfolded in a reality defined by risk. Mortality hovered constantly, both for the mother and the infant, and the people of the period were acutely aware of the dangers. Statistical estimates, reconstructed by modern historians and demographers, suggest that between 20 and 30% of infants did not survive their first year, and nearly half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Maternal mortality was similarly sobering. Childbirth remained one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. These numbers were not abstract figures for medieval families, they were lived experiences. Every villager could name households shattered by childbirth, mothers buried with their infants, or children orphaned and raised by relatives. The churchyards bore silent testimony in rows of unmarked graves. Life was celebrated at its beginning because its continuation was never assured. The reasons for such high mortality were numerous. Infection posed one of the gravest threats. Without knowledge of bacteria or antisepsis, even routine births could become fatal if puerperal fever, an infection of the uterus, took hold. Complications such as obstructed labor, breech presentation, or retained placenta often led to hemorrhage, and there were no surgical solutions available except in rare cases handled by barber surgeons, whose interventions were usually last resort and often unsuccessful. Infants, too, faced peril. Their immune systems were fragile, and respiratory failure, infection, and malnutrition could swiftly claim them. Premature births were poorly understood, and congenital conditions were interpreted through a mixture of folk belief and religious explanation. Some infants survived only hours, others days, and many died before baptism could be performed, a source of deep anguish for devout families. In this landscape of uncertainty, the midwife emerged as a figure of immense importance. She was not merely a birth attendant, but a custodian of knowledge accumulated through observation, oral tradition, and experience. Her skills represented the closest approximation to medical care available to most women. Midwives learned to read the progress of labor by touch and intuition, to identify when a child was misaligned in the womb, and to reposition infants through manual techniques passed down from older generations. Herbal lore constituted another strand of her expertise. Midwives employed infusions, salves, and compresses to ease pain, regulate contractions, reduce bleeding, and stimulate milk production. While not all remedies were effective by modern standards, many possessed genuine pharmacological properties. Plants such as pennyroyal, fennel, mugwort, and lavender played roles in easing childbirth, encouraging menstruation, or acting as mild analgesics. The midwife's authority was not solely medical. She also served as a spiritual intermediary. In cases where a priest could not arrive in time, midwives were authorized by the church to perform emergency baptisms, ensuring the salvation of the newborn soul should death be imminent. This ecclesiastical concession elevated the midwife to a position of sacred trust, for she held in her hands not only bodily survival, but eternal destiny. Despite their value, midwives occupied a complex social status. They were respected for their skill, yet also vulnerable to suspicion, particularly in later medieval and early modern periods when fears of witchcraft intensified. The same knowledge that enabled them to guide births could, in the eyes of some, be interpreted as tampering with nature or fate. Still, communities depended on them, for no alternative existed that could match their accessibility or expertise. The midwife's role extended beyond birth into the postpartum period. She monitored the mother for fever, excessive bleeding, or complications. She supervised the cleansing and swaddling of the infant, ensured breastfeeding commenced, and offered guidance about protective charms, prayers, and rituals designed to ward off illness or misfortune. Her visits reassured families that the perilous threshold between birth and survival had been crossed, even if only tentatively. In a society where life expectancy was modest and every birth represented a gamble, the midwife became a linchpin of communal stability. Her presence transformed childbirth from a solitary ordeal into a collective negotiation with mortality. Villages could endure famine, war, and disease only so long as children continued to be born and mothers lived long enough to raise them. The midwife, therefore, stood at the center of demographic resilience. Her value was not measured in coin alone. Families paid midwives in food, cloth, eggs, ale, or labor, and communities honored them with deference born of necessity. A midwife who developed a reputation for saving infants or navigating difficult births earned respect that transcended class or age. Some midwives served for decades, delivering multiple generations and becoming living archives of family history. Thus, in a world in which death shadowed birth so closely, midwives were not merely helpers, they were defenders of oblivion, guardians of both life and lineage. Their work represented the closest thing medieval villages had to health care, and their knowledge formed one of the most significant bodies of female expertise in pre-modern Europe. While some medieval villages possessed resident midwives, others depended on women who traveled from settlement to settlement, summoned whenever childbirth began. These traveling midwives constituted one of the most distinctive aspects of medieval reproductive culture, acting as mobile repositories of skill, lore, and communal support. Their journeys connected isolated households to the broader fabric of communal care. The need for traveling midwives arose from demographic realities. Villages were small, often consisting of only a few dozen households, and births did not occur frequently enough to justify a dedicated midwife in every hamlet. Thus, a midwife might serve multiple parishes or clusters of villages, covering several miles of rural territory. When labor began, a messenger, often a young boy or male relative, was dispatched to fetch her, running along dirt paths or riding on horseback if the family was fortunate enough to possess one. The urgency of such errands reflected not only the uncertainty of childbirth, but also the peculiar mixture of calculation and faith that governed medieval life. Women did not have exact knowledge of due dates, though they tracked pregnancy through experience and observation. Labor could commence unexpectedly, at night, or during inclement weather, compelling midwives to travel through rain, snow, or darkness. Tales survive in chronicles and folk memory of midwives arriving soaked, exhausted, or bruised from their journeys, yet greeted with profound relief. Upon arrival, the midwife entered a space that was often already transformed. Women of the household had darkened the room, drawn shutters, and placed warm cloths near the fire. The birthing stool might be positioned near the hearth for warmth. Herbs hung from beams or simmered in pots. The midwife's presence became the final element needed to begin the ordeal in earnest. Her tools were modest but purposeful: linen cloths, thread for tying the umbilical cord, herbs for pain or recovery, and sometimes small knives or hooks used only in catastrophic difficulties. Yet her most important instrument was her experience. Having seen dozens or even hundreds of births, she possessed the ability to assess labor's progress, sense when the fetus was misaligned, determine when to encourage pushing, and recognize when the mother needed rest. She knew which births would unfold swiftly and which required hours of endurance. The traveling midwife also brought with her news. She had visited other households, observed other children, and learned of illnesses or recoveries in neighboring settlements. In an era without formal communication networks, she became a carrier of information, bridging social divides and sustaining communal awareness. Her status afforded her entry into homes of varying wealth and social rank, granting her insight into the spectrum of rural life. Her authority extended beyond childbirth. Midwives often provided remedies for menstrual difficulties, infertility, lactation problems, and children's ailments. Their knowledge of the female body positioned them as indispensable medical figures in a society where male physicians rarely attended to women unless wealthy or noble. For peasants, barber surgeons were more accessible than university-trained physicians, yet even they rarely concerned themselves with obstetrics. Thus, the midwife stood virtually alone within her domain. Despite their importance, traveling midwives faced strains. The physical demands of journeying through rural landscapes were formidable, particularly for older women. The psychological burden was equally heavy. A celebrated birth elevated her reputation, but a death, whether mother or infant, could tarnish her standing, even if no expertise existed that could have prevented the tragedy. The community's dependence on her created both reverence and expectation. Traveling midwives also navigated complex religious and legal landscapes. The church recognized their necessity, granting them the exceptional ability to perform emergency baptisms. At the same time, clerical authorities sometimes scrutinized practices that merged Christian prayer with older folk traditions. Midwives invoked saints, but also used charms, amulets, or herbal incantations whose origins predated Christianity. Their syncretic methods reflected a cultural equilibrium rather than contradiction, for medieval spirituality encompassed forces both sacred and natural. Payment for their services varied. Coin was rare among the peasantry, so midwives received compensation in goods, loaves of bread, bolts of cloth, eggs, fruit, or portions of smoked meat. In lean seasons, payments might be deferred or symbolic. In prosperous times, midwives could accumulate modest wealth. The reciprocity of such exchanges reinforced social bonds. A family who benefited from a midwife's aid owed gratitude not under contract, but under the unspoken law of mutual obligation that governed medieval life. The traveling midwife's role reveals an important truth about medieval society. Despite rigid hierarchies and pervasive hardship, communities mobilized remarkable networks of care. Far from being passive victims of circumstance, medieval villagers cultivated systems of knowledge and mutual assistance that allowed them to endure. The figure of the traveling midwife stands at the crossroads between gender, medicine, and community. She was a healer without formal credentials, a spiritual intermediary without ordination, and a messenger without official title. Her authority derived not from books or institutions, but from experience, memory, and the trust of those who summoned her. In her journeys across fields and villages, she sustained the continuity of families and ensured that the first cries of newborns echoed through households that might otherwise have faced silence. She embodied the collective understanding that survival was a shared endeavor, and that in the face of mortality, the village must unite around the labor of bringing forth new life. In the medieval world, the idea of a doctor, as we understand today, was almost entirely disconnected from childbirth. Physicians were overwhelmingly men, trained through university systems that modeled themselves on ancient Greek and Roman texts. Their work was theoretical, scholarly, and largely separated from the physical realities of birth. Childbirth happened within women's spaces, which were inaccessible to male physicians both socially and culturally. This created an environment where the true experts of childbirth were not academically trained medical authorities, but women who had gained practical knowledge through life experience. Most midwives were older women, often in the later stages of their lives when their own childbearing years had passed. This wasn't accidental. It was a matter of survival and wisdom. A woman who had lived long enough to raise children and grandchildren had something extremely rare in the medieval world: survivorship experience. She had seen pregnancies, miscarriages, births, sickness, and infant deaths. She understood what an ordinary birth looked like and what a dangerous birth sounded like. She knew when to wait, when to act, and when to pray. Her credibility came from proximity to hardship, not academic study. These midwives were not just birth attendants, they were the social memory of female life. They remembered how a sister survived a breech birth, how an older neighbor stopped bleeding, how herbs soothed labor pains, and how positioning a mother differently changed the outcome. In a world before anatomy charts, surgical manuals, and institutional learning, experience was the entire textbook. And because childbirth was so unpredictable, The women who had seen it repeatedly held unmatched authority. Age also brought another practical advantage: freedom from active motherhood. A younger woman with infants or toddlers could not easily leave her home to attend births in other families. An older woman, especially a grandmother or a widow, had mobility. She could be called upon at any hour of the night, walk across fields or through villages, and stay at a birth for days if needed. Her household no longer depended on her at every moment. This gave her an autonomy unusual for medieval women. These midwives were also the gatekeepers of female community networks. They shared news about pregnancies, passed advice on breastfeeding, and sometimes advised on conception. In the eyes of society, they occupied a unique position, somewhere between healer, counselor, and spiritual figure. They were trusted deeply by women, though sometimes distrusted by men, who could not enter that space and thus regarded their knowledge as opaque or mysterious. Despite their expertise, medieval midwives did not see themselves as medical professionals in the modern sense. They did not wear special uniforms, hold titles, or operate under centralized regulation for most of the medieval period. Their authority was recognized informally through reputation, successful births, and the trust of families. A midwife who consistently lost mothers or children would not be sought again. A midwife who safely delivered infants became a vital part of community resilience. Because of their centrality to childbirth and family continuity, midwives shaped demographic realities. A skilled midwife meant more surviving children, stronger family lines, and better chances of laborers growing to adulthood. In a world where death hovered constantly at the edges of family life, the older woman with knowledge of birth played a role as crucial as any warrior, landholder, or craftsman. Through her hands passed the fragile beginnings of future generations.
The path to midwifery in the medieval period was not standardized, nor did it require a single background. Instead, midwives came from several common social identities that naturally aligned with practical knowledge and availability. Three groups appeared most often: experienced mothers, herbalists, and widows. Many midwives began as mothers who had endured multiple pregnancies and births themselves. A woman who had survived childbirth 4 or 5 times possessed first-hand understanding of labor stages, pain rhythms, and the emotional states of expectant mothers. Other women trusted her because she had lived the process. If she had breastfed, managed postpartum recovery, and raised infants through sickness, she also carried knowledge about early newborn care, swaddling, feeding, warming, and protection against infection. In a sense, her authority was biological. She embodied survival. Herbalists formed a second major path. In the medieval world, herbal knowledge was part of domestic medicine and largely the domain of women. Villages relied on plants for nearly everything: fevers, infections, wounds, digestion, infertility, and childbirth. An herbalist understood which plants soothed pain, which encouraged contractions, which slowed bleeding, and which reduced inflammation. Though not all herbalists became midwives, many midwives had some herbal skill. This overlap gave midwives a toolkit for assisting the body, especially in an era before anesthesia and antiseptics. Knowledge of herbs was not mystical in origin, it was empirical, built through generations of trial, error, and oral preservation. Widows made up a third major group. Widowhood changed a woman's social position dramatically. Freed from the legal authority of a husband, a widow had unusual independence for her time. She could travel, negotiate payments, and spend nights away from home attending births. Widows also tended to be older
and thus carried more community experience. In some regions of Europe, widows were explicitly preferred as midwives because they were seen as morally neutral in matters of childbirth, no longer sexually active, less likely to become pregnant themselves, and therefore able to devote energy to other women. Across these categories, the common denominator was perceived knowledge. Villagers did not choose a midwife based on certification, but based on trust, reputation, and testimony. If a woman was known to have successfully delivered infants, managed difficult labors, or cared well for mothers, word spread. Reputation in a rural community was everything. These midwives did not work in isolation. They belonged to a web of female knowledge that extended from the household to the fields and beyond. A birthing room might include mothers, sisters, cousins, and neighbors, all experienced in their own ways. The midwife was the coordinator, the most trusted presence, the one who understood not only the mechanics of birth, but the emotional landscape surrounding it. She reassured, commanded, and interpreted. She watched for danger signs, bleeding, fever, prolonged labor, or a child emerging in an irregular position. Their knowledge, while practical, was also deeply intertwined with religion and superstition. Prayers to saints, charms against misfortune, and ritual protections often accompanied herbal remedies and physical techniques. In a world where medicine could not explain disease or mortality, spiritual intervention was not decorative, it was essential. Thus, midwives emerged naturally from the women whose lives had prepared them for the intersection of biology, community, and survival. They were not doctors, nor did they claim to be. They were the carriers of ancestral female knowledge, and without them, medieval societies would have faced even greater loss. Medieval midwifery did not operate through written manuals, medical schools, or licensing boards, not in the sense we understand today. Knowledge of childbirth lived in a female-only world of spoken instruction, observation, and shared experience. Because nearly all literacy and academic medicine were controlled by men and church institutions, the knowledge women needed for childbirth could not rely on books. It had to survive through memory, apprenticeship, and demonstration. The most common path to becoming a midwife was through informal apprenticeship, though the term apprenticeship must be understood differently than in guild trades such as blacksmithing or weaving. There was rarely a formal contract, no fee for training, and no rigid timeline. Instead, younger women, often relatives, neighbors, or daughters of midwives, were invited to assist in births to observe and support. At first, they handled simple tasks, boiling linens, warming water, preparing herbs, or comforting the mother. Over time, they were gradually introduced to more advanced roles, monitoring the mother's breathing, helping adjust positions, or tending to the newborn after delivery. This hands-on learning allowed them to accumulate practical knowledge slowly and steadily. Oral tradition served as the primary textbook. Techniques were described aloud, stories were retold, and past births were analyzed after the fact. A midwife might say, "Last winter, a child stuck in the breech came by turning the mother to her hands and knees," or "A poultice of sage cooled the fever," or "Do not allow the cord to pull before the afterbirth passes." These instructions carried centuries of accumulated wisdom. Because they were spoken, not written, the knowledge had to be constantly practiced and reinforced, or it would evaporate within a generation. Most midwives began observing births long before they intended to become midwives themselves. Medieval life was densely communal, and births were not hidden away in sterile rooms. Neighbors knew when labor began, and women gathered for support. Even girls who were not formally training might witness elements of childbirth, breastfeeding, and infant care through family life. By the time a young woman reached adulthood, she had already absorbed foundational understanding simply by living in a world where birth was visible, frequent, and shared. The elder midwife's role was crucial. These women acted as repositories of long-term knowledge. They were the ones who remembered how births differed between seasons, how certain foods influenced pregnancy, how herbal combinations interacted, and how particular women in the village had died or survived. They trained successors not because the community demanded it, but because the community could not survive without continuity. If a midwife died unexpectedly without having passed on her knowledge, the village faced a crisis. In some rare cases, particularly in larger medieval towns or cities, midwifery training became more structured. Certain European regions, especially parts of France, Germany, and Italy, developed proto-institutional training models by the late medieval period, where city councils or church authorities issued certificates or oaths. However, this did not represent the majority of medieval childbirth experiences. The vast majority of births took place in rural villages far from universities or ecclesiastical medical oversight, and those areas continued relying on oral female networks into the early modern period. The absence of written instruction did not imply ignorance or backwardness. In fact, oral and practical teaching systems have existed effectively in many cultures across the world. What made medieval midwifery distinct was the fragility of its knowledge system. It depended on uninterrupted generational transmission. When later historical forces such as church regulation, witchcraft persecutions, or the rise of male medical practitioners disrupted that chain, much of the ancestral knowledge vanished. This method of learning also shaped the midwife's understanding of her own role. She did not see herself as a medical technician. She did not reduce birth to biological mechanisms. Instead, she viewed birth as a social and spiritual event, the arrival of a new soul, the test of a mother's strength, the fulfillment of marriage, and the continuation of community. Her education included not only physical skills, but social ones: how to calm fear, how to manage relatives, how to maintain dignity and privacy, and when to invoke religious support. In this sense, apprenticeship served as education not only in technique, but in womanhood. Through birth work, knowledge about menstruation, fertility, miscarriage, breastfeeding, nutrition, and sexuality circulated. These topics were rarely addressed in male-dominated academic medicine, which largely focused on humoral theory rather than practical reproductive experience. Thus, midwifery knowledge grew where written scholarship could not reach. It stayed alive because women kept telling it, showing it, repeating it, and embodying it. Their learning system was not institutional, but it was effective enough to deliver countless generations into the world. Medieval midwives occupied an ambiguous cultural place, both revered and distrusted, honored and feared. On one hand, they were treated with respect because they preserved life in a world where death was a constant threat. On the other hand, their knowledge and power made some communities uneasy, particularly as medieval society moved towards stricter religious regulation and suspicion of non-institutional healing practices. In earlier medieval centuries, roughly from the 5th to the 12th century, midwives were largely regarded with admiration. They were indispensable. Families needed them, villages relied on them, and the Christian Church itself often recognized the necessity of their work. Baptismal emergencies, where infants near death were baptized immediately after birth, even gave midwives limited spiritual authority to perform provisional baptisms. This grant of ritual responsibility indicated both trust and pragmatism. Church officials could not always reach a birth in time, but the midwife could. However, by the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, perceptions began to shift. As medical universities emerged and literacy expanded, men trained in academic medicine sought to legitimize their fields, sometimes portraying traditional female healers as unscientific or dangerous. Midwives, herbalists, and wise women became targets of skepticism. Their knowledge, once seen as ancestral, began to appear mysterious and thus suspicious. The church also played a role in reframing female healing. While early Christianity tolerated midwifery due to necessity, later religious authorities, particularly after the 13th century, became increasingly wary of autonomous female knowledge. Midwives not only handled birth, but also birth control, fertility, miscarriage, and sometimes abortion, though methods were primitive and often herbal. These aspects placed them at the intersection of theology, morality, and social regulation. In the eyes of increasingly dogmatic religious reformers, such control over reproduction could border on sin or heresy. This evolving suspicion eventually intersected with witchcraft accusations during the 15th to 17th centuries. It is important not to oversimplify. Not all midwives were accused of witchcraft, and medieval witchcraft fears were complex. However, midwives did appear among the accused more often than chance alone would suggest. Their access to herbs, their ability to influence reproductive outcomes, and their perceived power over life and death made them vulnerable targets. In some regions, especially in parts of Germany and Switzerland, midwives were explicitly named in witchcraft manuals such as the infamous Malleus Maleficarum. The contradiction was striking. The same communities that feared midwives also depended on them. A woman might whisper suspicions about a midwife's unnatural knowledge, yet call upon her desperately when labor began. In this sense, midwives occupied a social category that anthropologists sometimes call liminal. They existed at the borders, between life and death, between medicine and magic, between religion and folk belief. Their role was not merely practical, but symbolic. Despite suspicion, many regions continued to treat midwives with deep respect. In Mediterranean communities, for example, midwives were honored as guardians of birth and celebrated through feast days or incorporated into family rituals. In Jewish communities, midwives held special status because biblical tradition provided archetypes for their work, such as the Hebrew midwives Shifra and Puah. In Islamic territories, midwives retained legitimacy through medical texts and court patronage well into the early modern era. Thus, the image of the midwife in medieval culture was neither uniformly noble nor uniformly persecuted. She was necessary, powerful, and ambiguous, qualities that in any era can provoke both respect and fear.
To understand how medieval midwives were compensated, we have to separate our modern assumptions about work, wages, and professional transactions from the economic realities of medieval village life. Most Europeans during the medieval period did not live in a cash economy. Coinage certainly existed, especially in cities, but the overwhelming majority of rural households, where most births took place, relied on exchange, obligation, and reciprocal labor rather than monetary wages. Midwives, like many skilled community workers, operated within this non-monetary economic system. Their work was vital, time-consuming, and at times life-threatening, yet very few families paid them with coins. Instead, midwifery services were compensated through a network of gifts, goods, favors, and communal indebtedness. Payments varied depending on the region, the season, and the wealth of the household. A well-off farmer's family might offer a midwife a generous portion of grain or a length of finely woven cloth. A poorer family, unable to spare much, might offer eggs, butter, cheese, or vegetables from the garden. For especially difficult labors requiring days of attendance, families might slaughter a chicken or offer a share of meat during winter months. Livestock, such as a kid goat, a piglet, or a young hen, represented one of the most valuable forms of payment a midwife could receive, because animals multiplied and sustained a household. Cloth was another significant payment, especially in cultures where textile production consumed enormous labor. A bolt of wool, a linen shift, or even scraps for mending could serve as a form of currency. Textiles held value not merely for comfort, but for warmth, durability, and status. A midwife who amassed cloth could provide for her household, trade with neighbors, or craft items for resale at market. In regions where vineyards or orchards existed, payment could come in the form of wine, cider, or preserved fruit. These items were not luxuries but staples, particularly in winter when fresh produce became scarce. Salt, an essential preservative, was likewise a prized trade item and sometimes given to midwives in small quantities as compensation. Yet the exchange was not always tangible. A midwife might receive labor, protection, or services instead of goods. A neighbor might agree to repair her roof, help harvest her field, mend her tools, or send one of their sons to chop firewood for a winter. Debt could also take social form. A family owed the midwife a favor, and she could call upon that favor when in need. This reciprocal system helped bind the community together in ways money alone could not. Such arrangements placed the midwife at the center of a vast web of economic relationships. Her work provided her with resources and support that allowed her to survive without a husband or formal trade, a rare form of female independence in the medieval world. Indeed, some scholars argue that midwives were among the few medieval women capable of sustaining themselves economically without relying entirely on male kin. Compensation was also shaped by customary expectations. Some villages had long-standing traditions that dictated what a family owed the midwife after a birth. For example, in certain rural French communities, it was customary to present a loaf of bread and a measure of butter immediately after delivery, with additional offerings once the child survived its first month. In parts of Northern Europe, families gifted a portion of the baptismal feast to the midwife. In Mediterranean towns, midwives were sometimes invited as honored guests to post-birth celebrations or granted symbolic gifts that signified their role as the child's unofficial godmother. Not all compensation was voluntary. In certain regions, local authorities or guild-like organizations began regulating payment by the late medieval period. City statutes in Venice, Florence, and Paris specified minimum fees for midwives, sometimes tied to the social status of the mother. Wealthier women might owe a more lavish gift, while poorer women received services free of charge, with costs absorbed by the parish or community fund. Religious institutions also played a role in shaping compensation, especially where church doctrine emphasized charity. Midwives were sometimes expected to help impoverished women without expectation of payment, particularly if the birth was dangerous or urgent. In such cases, the midwife's labor became an act of communal mercy. In return, the church might support her by offering food or alms during festivals or famine periods. Another financial aspect often overlooked is the risk midwives assumed. If a mother or child died, the midwife's reputation, and therefore her livelihood, might suffer. Compensation, then, was not simply about reward, but about survival under conditions of precarious social evaluation. A family satisfied with the outcome would feel indebted. A family grieving a loss might pay nothing and avoid the midwife thereafter. Despite the challenges, compensation systems offered midwives a measure of social mobility relative to other women of similar background. A successful midwife could accumulate resources that allowed her to live comfortably in old age, support orphaned relatives, or manage a household as a widow without dependence on remarriage. In some documented cases, midwives left behind modest inheritances, land, tools, animals, and textiles, indicating that her labor held real economic weight. Thus, payment for midwifery services illuminates much about medieval life: the scarcity of cash, the centrality of reciprocity, the value of labor, and the delicate balance between service, survival, and community obligation. Midwives were not merely healers, but participants in a living economy,
where human birth itself formed part of the exchange system that sustained medieval society.
In the medieval world, pregnancy unfolded without ultrasounds, due dates, fetal monitoring, or medical calendars. Yet women developed their own highly practical ways of recognizing pregnancy and estimating when birth was approaching. These methods were rooted in observation, embodied knowledge, and community memory, skills passed between generations of mothers, grandmothers, midwives, and neighbors. Pregnancy recognition typically began with the most obvious sign, the cessation of monthly bleeding. Medieval women might not have spoken openly about menstruation in church or formal settings, but it was well understood among women. A missed cycle, followed by a second, suggested conception. But the absence of bleeding alone did not confirm pregnancy, because illness, famine, stress, or hard labor could also disrupt menstruation. Thus, women looked for corroborating signs, changes in appetite, swelling of the breasts, morning nausea, sensitivities to smell, or a change in the woman's mood and energy. The concept of quickening, the first felt movements of the fetus, held particular cultural and legal importance. In many parts of medieval Europe, pregnancy was not considered fully confirmed until the woman felt the child stir within her, usually around the 4th or 5th month. This moment carried religious significance as well, since some theologians debated whether quickening signaled the presence of the soul. Midwives often asked expectant mothers about quickening to determine the pregnancy's progress. Estimating the time of birth required different skills. Without calendars or standardized due dates, women relied on counting moons. Some would say that birth generally came after 9 rounds of the moon, aligning loosely with the human gestational period. Others tracked seasons. If conception was believed to have occurred during planting, birth would come near harvest. If during the harvest feast, birth might come in spring. Such systems were imprecise but surprisingly workable in communities where survival rhythms were intimately tied to nature. Observation of bodily changes also guided timekeeping. As birth approached, midwives watched for the belly to drop, for swelling in the feet and hands to increase, for changes in gait, and for the mother to feel pressure in her lower abdomen. The mother's breathing, sleep patterns, and appetite were also monitored. Just as importantly, women listened to stories from past pregnancies, comparing their own experience to sisters, mothers, or cousins. Because births were communal, each woman carried a mental map of what near term looked like. Labor itself was not always recognized immediately. Early contractions could be mistaken for indigestion, fatigue from fieldwork, or menstrual pain. Experienced women might advise the mother to walk, rest, or bathe to see if the sensation changed. Only when contractions became rhythmic and harder to dismiss did the community accept that labor had begun. At that point, the clock began, not measured in minutes, but in the endurance of pain, the mother's breath, and the midwife's judgment. This embodied timekeeping was not scientific in the clinical sense, but it was adaptive enough to function in a world without measurement tools. It ensured that women remained attuned not to numbers, but to their bodies, their histories, and their communities.
When signs of labor became unmistakable, one of the first tasks was summoning the midwife.
In rural villages, this often meant sending a messenger through fields, forest paths, or narrow lanes, sometimes in the middle of the night. Young boys were frequently chosen for the task because they ran fast, knew the paths between hamlets, and could move through public spaces freely. Their job carried urgency, yet also a sense of pride. They were helping usher a new life into the village. Messenger boys were not the only couriers. Older children, sisters, cousins, or even husbands sometimes ran for the midwife. In winter, when snow made travel slow, midwives might be sent for by sled or by men equipped with lanterns. In coastal villages, midwives sometimes rowed in fishing boats between settlements. The specific methods depended on geography, but the necessity was universal. A midwife must be found quickly. Communication between villages relied on long-standing social networks. Midwives often served not just their own settlement, but several surrounding hamlets. Their reputation spread through marriages, baptisms, seasonal markets, and festival gatherings. Families knew which midwife was closest, which was most skilled, or which had experience with difficult births. Messenger routes developed over time, a knowledge almost as valuable as the midwife's herbal toolkit. The distance to the midwife affected outcomes. In remote areas, labor might progress before she arrived, forcing neighbors or relatives to begin preparations on her behalf. In extreme cases, women birthed alone or attended only by their mothers or sisters. Yet even then, the midwife would arrive later to handle postpartum care, inspect the infant, and ensure proper recovery. The urgency of summoning reflected not only medical necessity, but social ritual. The arrival of the midwife marked the official beginning of birth work. Her presence transformed anxiety into orderly action. Her arrival meant that the community had fulfilled its duty to the mother. The rest now lay in the hands of women's collective knowledge.
The birthing chamber was a carefully crafted environment. Medieval beliefs held that childbirth required warmth, privacy, and containment. Cold air was thought to slow labor, weaken the mother, and increase the risk of illness. Thus, windows were shuttered, doors closed, and drafts blocked. Heavy curtains or blankets might be hung to trap heat and maintain a womb-like atmosphere. The room's warmth symbolically and practically prepared the mother for the arrival of new life. Candles and lamps provided light. In winter, a fire in the hearth was essential, not only for light and warmth, but for heating water and sterilizing linens through boiling. The glow of firelight transformed the room into a liminal space, separate from ordinary household life. Men were rarely permitted inside. This exclusion was practical, moral, and symbolic. Birth belonged to women's hands and women's knowledge. The birthing chamber became a world within a world, marked by secrecy and sanctity. Furniture was rearranged. A low stool or birthing chair might be placed near the fire. Straw was spread on the floor for warmth or to absorb fluids, later burned for sanitation. Beds were sometimes pushed against the wall so the mother could grip the frame during contractions. Ropes might be hung from ceiling beams for the mother to hold, allowing her to brace and bear down more effectively. Pillows, if available, cushioned her back or knees. The preparation of space served emotional and spiritual purposes as well. The chamber insulated the mother from distraction and judgment. It provided a controlled environment in a world otherwise governed by natural forces, hunger, war, and weather. In that room, for a brief time, women commanded their own realm. Through warmth, light, and enclosure, they created a sanctuary for birth, a fragile shelter against the unknown. Childbirth in the medieval world was never meant to be a solitary event.
It drew together a circle of women who shared responsibility, experience, and emotional labor. Once the birthing chamber was prepared and the midwife summoned, the next step was to assemble the helpers, a network woven from kinship, neighborhood bonds, and religious duty. Female relatives were often the first to participate. Mothers, sisters, aunts, and older daughters gathered to support the laboring woman, just as earlier generations had supported them. These women provided comfort, held hands, wiped brows, changed linens, guided breathing, and soothed fear. Their presence was not merely sentimental. Labor could last many hours, even days, and the midwife alone could not perform every task. Relatives brought endurance, food, and continuity, reminding the mother she belonged to a lineage that had survived birth before. Beyond family, neighbors played a crucial role. In villages, neighbors were often as close as kin. They assisted for practical reasons, fetching water, collecting herbs, tending the hearth, or looking after the household's other children. This form of communal labor was reciprocal. A woman who helped today would tomorrow need help at her own birth. Through this exchange system, villages built resilience against the ever-present risk of maternal death. Another category of helper consisted of experienced older women who were not midwives but had seen many births. They possessed the invaluable skill of calmness. Their voices could steady a frightened mother, and their memories offered examples of successful births, even when complications arose. In a world without pain medication or medical interventions, emotional endurance was as vital as physical stamina. Spiritual support was also present. Some births included designated prayer attendants, women who recited psalms, invoked saints, or whispered protective blessings. In Catholic regions, they might call upon Saint Margaret or Saint Anne, patron saints associated with childbirth. In Orthodox territories, icons were brought into the chamber and placed near the bed or stool. The presence of religious women did not diminish the practical work of midwives. Rather, it complemented it, reinforcing the belief that birth bridged the boundaries between earthly and divine realms. In some rural areas, the helpers also managed external affairs. They updated the father waiting outside, tended farm animals, reassured siblings, borrowed supplies from neighbors, or sought a priest if the situation threatened baptismal urgency. Because men were prohibited from entering the birthing chamber, they depended on the midwife's female network for all information and outcomes. To modern observers, such gatherings might seem chaotic or intrusive, but to medieval mothers, they provided security, dignity, and community presence. Birth was not handled in sterile isolation. It was a ritual of continuity enacted through the collective strength of women. The helpers formed a protective circle, a living architecture surrounding the new life about to enter the world.
Childbirth in the medieval world was never meant to be a solitary event. It drew together a circle of women who shared responsibility, experience, and emotional labor. Once the birthing chamber was prepared and the midwife summoned, the next step was to assemble the helpers, a network woven from kinship, neighborhood bonds, and religious duty. Male relatives were often the first to participate. Mothers, sisters, aunts, and older daughters gathered to support the laboring woman, just as earlier generations had supported them. These women provided comfort, held hands, wiped brows, changed linens, guided breathing, and soothed fear. Their presence was not merely sentimental. Labor could last many hours, even days, and the midwife alone could not perform every task. Relatives brought endurance, food, and continuity, reminding the mother she belonged to a lineage that had survived birth before. Beyond family, neighbors played a crucial role. In villages, neighbors were often as close as kin. They assisted for practical reasons, fetching water, collecting herbs, tending the hearth, or looking after the household's other children. This form of communal labor was reciprocal. A woman who helped today would tomorrow need help at her own birth. Through this exchange system, villages built resilience against the ever-present risk of maternal death. Another category of helper consisted of experienced older women who were not midwives but had seen many births. They possessed the invaluable skill of calmness. Their voices could steady a frightened mother, and their memories offered examples of successful births even when complications arose. In a world without pain medication or medical interventions, emotional endurance was as vital as physical stamina. Spiritual support was also present. Some births included designated prayer attendants, women who recited psalms, invoked saints, or whispered protective blessings. In Catholic regions, they might call upon Saint Margaret or Saint Anne, patron saints associated with childbirth. In Orthodox territories, icons were brought into the chamber and placed near the bed or stool. The presence of religious women did not diminish the practical work of midwives, rather it complemented it, reinforcing the belief that birth bridged the boundaries between earthly and divine realms. In some rural areas, the helpers also managed external affairs. They updated the father waiting outside, tended farm animals, reassured siblings, borrowed supplies from neighbors, or sought a priest if the situation threatened baptismal urgency. Because men were prohibited from entering the birthing chamber, they depended on the midwife's female network for all information and outcomes. To modern observers, such gatherings might seem chaotic or intrusive, but to medieval mothers they provided security, dignity, and community presence. Birth was not handled in sterile isolation. It was a ritual of continuity enacted through the collective strength of women. The helpers formed a protective circle, a living architecture surrounding the new life about to enter the world.
The birthing chamber demanded careful preparation of supplies, a combination of practical necessities and remedies rooted in folk medicine. Without antiseptics, anesthesia, or surgical tools, midwives relied on resources drawn from gardens, forests, livestock, and household stores. Clean water, often heated over the hearth, was central. It washed hands, rinsed cloths, and soothed the mother's forehead. Water held symbolic meaning as well, serving as a medium for emergency baptism if the infant appeared weak or still. Midwives understood that boiling linens reduced disease risk long before germ theory was articulated. Such techniques emerged from observation and practice rather than academic science. Cloths and linens were essential for absorbing fluids, wrapping the newborn, and supporting the mother's body. Wealthier households might have fine linens, while poorer families used rough wool or hemp cloth. In some regions, cloth reserved for birth was stored for months as a sign of readiness. After the birth, these cloths were washed, burned, or repurposed, depending on the local customs and the perceived holiness of the event. Straw played an unexpected yet practical role. Spread across the chamber floor, it insulated against cold, absorbed moisture, and kept the environment cleaner than bare earth or wooden boards. Straw was cheap, abundant, and easily disposed of. In certain areas, the burned straw became a ritual safeguard, believed to carry away the dangers associated with childbirth. In the medieval world, childbirth was one of the few spaces from which men were almost universally barred. This exclusion was not merely social etiquette, it was cultural, religious, practical, and deeply gendered. Birth was considered part of the female domain, a domain that encompassed not just reproduction,
but also midwifery, herbal medicine, ritual healing, and community caregiving. To medieval thinking, men simply did not belong in the birthing room, and their presence was believed to disrupt the delicate balance between pain, concentration, and the communal female support system. For the father of the child, waiting outside was emotionally complex. Some fathers prayed in silence, pacing near the hearth or courtyard. Others stood outside the dwelling entirely, listening anxiously for sounds that might signal success or tragedy, the wail of a newborn or the heavy, mournful hush that indicated something had gone wrong. In many places, fathers gathered other male relatives or neighbors to await news, sometimes drinking ale, sometimes reciting psalms, sometimes trying to distract themselves with work. Their enforced absence was a reminder that their authority in the household did not extend to the mysteries of childbirth. Within the birthing room, female relatives, mothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, assumed roles based on age, experience, and temperament. Neighbors were often invited as well, not only to help with the physical labor of the event, but to act as witnesses to legitimacy and community continuity. Beyond practical reasons, secrecy and modesty played crucial roles. Female chastity and bodily modesty were heavily emphasized in medieval moral life. A woman in childbirth was exposed and vulnerable. Exposing her body to men outside of midwives or physicians was unthinkable. There were also theological dimensions to this separation. The Church tended to associate childbirth with Eve's punishment from the book of Genesis, "In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children." Pain was not merely biological, it was moral and spiritual. This framing reinforced the notion that childbirth belonged to women who bore the biblical burden of labor, and it encouraged female-only spiritual rituals, such as prayers to the Virgin Mary for intercession or the laying of blessed charms beneath pillows. In rare cases when men did enter the birthing room, it was usually due to emergencies or unusual circumstances, such as the presence of a male physician in wealthy households during the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. But these were exceptions, not norms, and they were often met with discomfort or disapproval from the women present. The overwhelming majority of births, especially in rural Europe, took place in all-female environments until the 18th century. The absence of men also shaped the emotional culture of birth. This was a space where women encouraged, whispered, prayed, sang, wept, and instructed one another without male oversight. It formed one of the strongest communal female bonds of medieval village life. For the woman giving birth, the memory of being surrounded by other women, by familiar voices and hands, was one of the few comforts available in a world without anesthesia, medical science, and pain relief beyond herbs and prayer. So, childbirth was not merely a medical event, it was a social ritual, a spiritual passage, and a strictly guarded female domain. In that room, women were sovereign.
Before the rise of modern obstetrics, women did not usually give birth lying flat on a bed. The horizontal hospital delivery position, now widely recognized, is actually a comparatively modern invention, made convenient for physicians rather than mothers. Medieval European women birthed in a variety of upright, supported, or semi-upright positions that made physiological sense in an age before surgical intervention. The birthing stool was the main star of this tradition. The birth stool was typically a low wooden chair with a hole in the seat, and sometimes with hand grips on the sides. Some had 3 legs, others 4, and many had carved backs or arms for the mother to brace against.
A midwife or assistant sat or crouched beneath the stool, ready to receive the infant. The stool offered gravity assistance, opening of the pelvis, an easier downward passage which reduced prolonged labor. These stools appear in medieval manuscripts, church carvings, and midwife manuals, testifying to their widespread use. Besides stools, ropes and poles were also important. A rope hung from a ceiling beam or a sturdy rod was mounted horizontally for the mother to grip. Women could squat, lean, or brace themselves during contractions. Squatting positions opened the pelvis, increased force, and allowed mothers to direct their own pushing rhythm. In some regions, particularly Scandinavia and the Germanic countryside, women gave birth in a supported squatting posture while two attendants held them by the arms. Beds were used, but typically only during early labor or immediately after birth for recovery. Sometimes a woman labored on her knees, leaning over pillows or a pile of blankets, another posture that aided gravity and comfort. The midwife's ability to guide position changes was crucial. She read the body, the rhythm of contractions, and the mother's endurance. Upright birthing was not only practical, it was traditional and culturally encoded. Medieval midwives inherited knowledge from mothers, not from texts, so whatever worked was preserved. Even iconography of the Virgin Mary giving birth, one of the most important religious images, sometimes depicts her in seated or upright positions, reinforcing the normalcy of such methods. Postures varied also by region and class. Wealthy women in urban homes sometimes adopted more reclining positions, especially as male physicians began entering the childbirth space in later centuries. But in rural Europe, the heart of medieval fertility, upright birthing remained the rule. Only with the medicalization of birth in the early modern period did women begin to be placed flat, primarily for the convenience of doctors who needed easier visual and physical access. In medieval times, birth was shaped by pragmatism and experience rather than ideology. Tools were simple, crafted by local hands, and adapted over generations. The birthing stool, the rope, the leaning bed, these were not mere furniture, but instruments of survival.
Upright birthing dominated medieval Europe for reasons that were anatomical, cultural, and practical. The female body, when upright, uses gravity to assist in the descent of the fetus. The pelvis widens more naturally, the uterus contracts more efficiently, and the labor time, especially in second stage, tends to shorten. All of this was discovered not by anatomical textbooks, but by generations of women observing other women's births. Upright birthing also reduced the likelihood of obstructed labor, a major cause of maternal mortality. Without surgical options like cesarean section, rare and almost always fatal for the mother in medieval times, obstructed labor could mean hours or days of agony. Upright positions gave the best chance for spontaneous resolution. Midwives learned to alter posture based on signs, if pushing stalled, if pain increased, if the head failed to descend. These changes were analogs to what modern obstetrics calls positional management. Cultural factors reinforced this. In many medieval German, Slavic, and Scandinavian regions, birthing upright was connected to ideas of strength and proper female conduct. A woman who birthed sitting or squatting was seen as cooperating with nature rather than resisting it. Some birthing stools were even heirlooms passed down through families or maintained collectively by village midwives. There was also simply no compelling reason to adopt horizontal birth until male physicians started entering the birthing sphere. When that shift occurred in the 16th to 18th centuries, the woman's body was repositioned not for her benefit, but for the doctor's line of sight. Yet this would have seemed absurd to a medieval villager. Why lie down against gravity during the most painful and dangerous ordeal of a woman's life? Finally, upright birth made sense for the pace of medieval living. Most women worked physically demanding tasks: spinning, washing, milking, gathering, cooking. Their muscles were accustomed to squatting, lifting, and maintaining balance, so upright labor was not physically foreign. Lying confined in a bed for extended labor was far less practical for women whose bodies had been conditioned by work. Thus, upright birth was the logical standard until outside forces, science, gender dynamics, and professional medicine reshaped the norms.
The medieval midwife was much more than a birth attendant. She was the orchestrator of an entire event. In the birthing chamber, she commanded the space with a mixture of authority, confidence, ritual, and emotional intelligence. Her voice cut through panic. Her hands guided trembling limbs and slippery newborns. Her presence often made the difference between life and death. Midwives directed posture changes, breathing rhythms, pushing timing, and rest periods. They monitored signs of danger, bleeding, exhaustion, malposition, retained placenta, using senses rather than instruments. Their knowledge was experiential, built from years of catching babies, not from schooling. Yet their authority was absolute inside the birthing room, a reversal of the usual medieval social hierarchy in which women lacked formal power. A skilled midwife could quiet a frantic mother with a slow whisper, distract her with storytelling, or encourage her with communal chanting. She could order relatives to fetch more hot water, rearrange blankets, boil linens, or fetch additional herbs. If the labor grew difficult, her demeanor had to remain steady. Medieval midwives understood that panic spread through a birthing room like fire. Fear increased tension, tension increased pain, pain increased danger. Part of her leadership also involved spiritual management. She might instruct attendants to recite prayers to the Virgin Mary or to local saints associated with childbirth. She might place holy relics under pillows, sprinkle blessed salt around the bed, or tie charms to the woman's clothing. Such rituals were not mere superstition, they were psychological support mechanisms in a world without medical security nets. The midwife's authority ended once the child was safely born and examined. She checked for deformities, verified breathing, cleaned the infant, and swaddled tightly. She then assisted in the delivery of the placenta, a stage as dangerous as the birth itself. Only after bleeding slowed and mother and child were stable did she relinquish command.
Medieval medicine was inseparable from humoral theory, a framework inherited from Greek antiquity and refined through Galenic texts. Central to this worldview was the belief that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each corresponding to qualities of hot, cold, wet, or dry. Health, including pregnancy and childbirth, depended on maintaining the right balance among these humors. Disease or complications were understood as imbalances, often triggered by diet, activity, climate, or emotional states. For women in labor, humoral thinking shaped every intervention. If a mother felt cold or sluggish, midwives might warm her with blankets, fire, or heated oils, believing that warmth encouraged blood flow and eased contractions. If she was feverish, cooling herbs such as mint or chamomile might be applied to restore equilibrium. Foods were prescribed according to humoral properties. Lean meats or root vegetables might be considered warming, while dairy or cucumbers were seen as cooling. Even emotional states were humoralized. Fear, grief, or anger were believed to disrupt bodily balance and therefore could delay labor or cause excessive bleeding.
Humoral theory also dictated postpartum care. Mothers were thought vulnerable to imbalances after childbirth. Exposure to cold or dampness might induce fever, suffocation, or prolonged weakness. Midwives ensured that women were wrapped in warm linens, received appropriate nourishment, and avoided overexertion. Newborns were similarly humoralized. Some communities applied ointments, warmed swaddling, or herbal baths intended to stabilize their delicate systems. This framework provided a conceptual logic for intervention, even in the absence of anatomical knowledge. While some humoral practices were harmful, many, like keeping mothers warm, hydrated, and nourished, actually promoted survival, demonstrating that medieval medicine combined empirical observation with philosophical theory.
The intellectual foundations of medieval childbirth practices were heavily influenced by two towering figures, Aristotle and Galen. Aristotle's writings on reproduction described the roles of male and female seed in conception, the development of the embryo, and the mechanics of gestation. Although sometimes inaccurate by modern standards, his ideas filtered into medieval thinking and informed assumptions about fetal growth, maternal influence, and nutrition. Galen, a Greek physician of the 2nd century CE, extended Aristotle's theories and developed a system of medicine based on the humors. His detailed observations, anatomical texts, and prescriptions became the authoritative medical reference for centuries. In particular, Galen's work on the uterus, the menstrual cycle, and the balance of bodily fluids framed the way midwives understood pregnancy. Midwives may not have read Galen directly, but scribes, physicians, and manuals distilled his ideas into practical instructions for women's care, herbal use, and birth preparation. This intellectual backdrop reinforced the humoral approach. A sluggish mother or infant might be considered dominated by phlegm. A mother experiencing excessive bleeding might be hot or have an overabundance of blood. Remedies followed suit with careful application of heat, cold, wet, or dry substances. The authority of Aristotle and Galen gave a philosophical legitimacy to midwives' practical knowledge. It suggested that birth and pregnancy were not chaotic, unpredictable events, but processes governed by observable rules that could be understood, manipulated, and even predicted. Even folklore and superstition were often interpreted through a Galenic lens. For example, certain foods or herbs were avoided not simply because of ritual belief, but because physicians or midwives believed they disrupted humoral balance. Thus, the midwife's craft was a marriage of inherited wisdom, empirical observation, and classical theory. Alongside classical theory, folklore permeated the experience of pregnancy in medieval Europe. Cravings were often seen as omens. A mother who desired sour foods might predict a child with a sour temperament. Cravings for sweet foods might indicate a prosperous life. Such interpretations were not merely superstitious. They guided behavior, informed communal expectations, and offered reassurance in the uncertain months of gestation. Timekeeping and calendrical patterns were also central to folklore. Lunar cycles were thought to influence conception, gestation, and delivery. Women might track phases of the moon to anticipate labor, believing that births occurring during the full moon or a certain lunar sign could result in stronger or more virtuous children. Similarly, saints' days were often invoked for protection. Laboring women or midwives might pray specifically to a saint whose feast day coincided with the expected delivery, believing that divine favor could influence outcomes. Other rituals emerged from oral tradition. Tying special knots in the mother's clothing, wearing particular colors, or observing prohibitions on work
sexual activity, or certain foods during pregnancy. Folk wisdom emphasized pattern recognition. If previous pregnancies had certain outcomes under specific seasonal, dietary, or spiritual circumstances, the same patterns might be repeated or avoided. Even as these practices appear quaint to modern eyes, they had psychological and social functions. Folklore reduced anxiety, structured labor preparation, and reinforced community norms. Ritualized care, charms, and predictions were forms of pre-modern risk management in a context where medical intervention was limited and infant mortality was high. Midwives, deeply embedded in these cultural networks, often mediated between folklore, spiritual belief, and humoral reasoning to guide women safely through pregnancy.
Herbal medicine was a cornerstone of medieval maternity care, and the midwife's knowledge of plants was both practical and extensive. Herbs served a variety of purposes: easing nausea, calming anxiety, reducing fever, promoting circulation, and preparing the body for labor. Among the most commonly used were mint, fennel, lavender, and rue. Mint was prized for its cooling properties, calming the stomach and relieving digestive discomfort. It could be brewed as a tea, chewed fresh, or added to poultices applied to the body. Fennel was used to relieve bloating, promote milk production after birth, and reduce digestive pain. Its seeds were commonly crushed or infused in warm water. Lavender, with its soothing aroma, was burned, placed in pillows, or infused in oils to calm nerves, ease muscle tension, and create a pleasant environment during labor. Rue had a dual function. It was believed to strengthen the uterus, aid in regulating menstruation, and protect against spiritual danger, such as evil spirits that might harm the mother or infant. Herbs were prepared carefully. Fresh leaves were harvested at optimal times of day, dried for later use, and combined with other ingredients according to experience and regional tradition. Midwives often grew herb gardens near their homes or foraged in nearby fields and forests. The skill lay not only in identifying plants, but in dosing them correctly and knowing which combinations were effective. The application of herbs was closely tied to the mother's comfort. Warm baths infused with mint or chamomile could ease soreness. Poultices applied to the back or abdomen soothed muscle strain. Teas calmed the digestive system and relieved anxiety. These herbal interventions exemplify how medieval women combined observation, experience, and natural materials to manage pregnancy in an era before chemical medicines.
While herbs offered remedies, they were not without risks. Certain plants were considered dangerous because of their potent physiological effects, and midwives had to balance therapeutic benefits against potential harm.
One well-known example is pennyroyal, a plant recognized for its ability to induce uterine contractions. In small doses, some traditions used it cautiously to promote labor, but misjudging the dose could result in miscarriage or maternal poisoning. Pennyroyal thus represented the double-edged nature of herbal knowledge, powerful when wielded correctly, deadly when misused. Other herbs carried cautionary reputations. Certain varieties of tansy, rue, or hellebore were sometimes recommended for digestive or circulatory benefits, but could trigger uterine spasms if overdosed. Midwives needed to know not only the correct plant species, but the season, freshness, and preparation method. Misidentification was a real danger, particularly in regions where multiple similar plants grew side by side. Regulations sometimes emerged around herb use. In urban areas, city ordinances occasionally restricted the sale or distribution of strong herbs to licensed practitioners. Midwives in such regions relied on accumulated experience, oral tradition, and local knowledge to avoid mistakes. In rural villages, the responsibility fell entirely on the midwife. A miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences for mother and child. Despite these risks, herbs were indispensable. They offered the only effective form of pain relief, uterine stimulation, and postpartum care available. When used prudently, herbal remedies contributed significantly to survival rates and maternal comfort. Knowledge of which plants to use and which to avoid was a hallmark of the skilled midwife. In this way, herbal medicine formed a bridge between empirical practice and humoral theory, combining observation, trial and error learning, and traditional wisdom in a system that, while imperfect, often saved lives.
In absence of modern instruments, thermometers, or fetal monitors, medieval midwives relied entirely on their hands, eyes, and intuition to assess the progress of labor.
Examining a mother's body manually was a delicate balance of skill, experience, and judgment. The midwife needed to determine how far the labor had progressed, whether the cervix had dilated sufficiently, the position of the fetus, and whether complications were arising, all without causing unnecessary harm or pain. Physical examination began with observation. The midwife watched the mother's breathing, posture, facial expressions, and movements during contractions. These signs indicated not only how advanced the labor was, but how the mother's body was responding to pain. Then came tactile assessment. With gloved or bare hands, the midwife gently palpated the abdomen, feeling for the position of the fetus, its orientation, and whether it was descending. She might feel for the fetal head through the cervix, checking alignment with the birth canal. This manual approach required a deep mental map of anatomy, developed over years of apprenticeship. The midwife knew what was normal and what was dangerous. She could detect malpresentation, a fetus lying sideways or breech, and judge whether labor would progress naturally or require intervention. Every assessment had to be done carefully, for invasive or forceful examination could cause trauma to mother or child. Importantly, manual examination was also a communication tool. The midwife conveyed reassurance through touch. Gentle palpation and positioning reassured the mother that she was being monitored and guided. Mothers often trusted the midwife's hands more than anyone else's advice, and this physical presence created a bond of authority and calm in the birthing room. One of the most crucial tasks of medieval midwife was ensuring that the fetus was positioned optimally for birth. Malpositioning, particularly breech or transverse presentation, could be fatal without surgical intervention. Midwives learned techniques to encourage the fetus into a more favorable position, relying on gravity, maternal movement, and manual manipulation. Gravity played a central role. Upright birthing positions, including squatting or kneeling while leaning forward, allowed the fetus to descend naturally. The midwife might instruct the mother to rock, sway, or adjust her posture to shift the fetal orientation. These movements were carefully timed with contractions to take advantage of the body's natural rhythms. Manual repositioning was used sparingly, given the risk of injury. Using lubricated hands and warm oils, the midwife might gently guide a limb or the head to reduce obstruction. For breech presentations, she could encourage the mother to assume positions that helped the baby rotate. These maneuvers required experience and intuition. Even a skilled midwife risked provoking premature rupture of membranes, excessive bleeding, or fetal distress. In the medieval mindset, the hands of the midwife were extensions of her knowledge, calibrated over years to detect and correct issues that could not otherwise be managed. This combination of gravity, posture, and gentle manual adjustment reflected both empirical observation and practical necessity. The midwife worked in harmony with the mother's body, reading tension, contraction strength, and fetal position in real time, using techniques passed down through generations. Medieval midwives were experts at psychological as well as physical support. Breathing guidance was central to calming the mother, regulating contractions, and reducing the likelihood of panic. Midwives instructed mothers to inhale deeply during contraction buildup and exhale steadily during pushing. This technique, while simple, synchronized maternal effort with the rhythms of labor, conserving energy and improving the effectiveness of each push. Soothing rituals complemented breathing. The room might be filled with calming scents from herbs such as lavender or chamomile. Attendants might chant prayers, hum familiar melodies, or recite psalms. Light, warmth, and gentle touch all contributed to a controlled atmosphere. These rituals were more than symbolic. They helped reduce fear, which in turn decreased tension in the uterus, making labor safer and more efficient. Touch was another critical aspect of soothing. Massages along the back, shoulders, or thighs helped the mother release muscle tension. The midwife's hands communicated authority and care, creating a sense of safety. In a time without anesthesia, the psychological environment, calm, guided, and intentional, was sometimes as crucial as physical intervention. Pain management in medieval childbirth relied on natural, non-invasive techniques. Massages were widely used. Midwives rubbed the lower back, hips, and abdomen to ease muscle tension and improve circulation. These massages often incorporated oils infused with herbs such as lavender, rue, or chamomile, which added both aromatic and soothing qualities. Warmth was another essential tool. Heated cloths or compresses were applied to the abdomen, back, or perineum to relax muscles and relieve pain. Water heated over the hearth could be used as a gentle compress or for maternal bathing before or during labor. The heat not only alleviated discomfort, but also supported circulation and encouraged labor progression. Herbal infusions were ingested or applied topically to support relaxation and reduce nausea or cramping. Teas made from mint, fennel, or chamomile were consumed to soothe the stomach and calm the mind. Poultices of rue or sage might be applied to aid contraction rhythm or reduce postpartum bleeding. While these interventions were not anesthetic by modern standards, they provided practical comfort, reduced stress, and improved the chances of a successful birth in a time without chemical pain relief. In medieval Europe, childbirth was inseparable from spiritual protection. Constant prayers were offered to saints associated with safe delivery, most notably Saint Margaret of Antioch, a revered patroness of childbirth. Her legend, featuring miraculous survival from a dragon, symbolizing danger and evil, resonated with mothers and midwives alike. Women invoked her protection to safeguard mother and child, reciting prayers aloud or silently while performing physical care. Other saints were similarly important. Saint Anne, Mary, and regional holy figures were called upon for intercession. Religious charms, prayer scrolls, or blessed objects might be placed in the birthing room or near the mother. Midwives often led these rituals, harmonizing spiritual care with practical assistance and guiding attendants in repetitive chants or gestures to create a focused, calming environment. Prayers were not purely symbolic. In a society where maternal and infant mortality were high, spiritual activity provided emotional resilience. Belief in divine oversight reduced panic, encouraged compliance with midwife instructions, and structured the birthing experience. The constant recitation of prayers formed an invisible support system, a communal shield of hope in a dangerous process.
Crises were a constant threat in medieval childbirth, and midwives had practical techniques for dealing with them, even in the absence of modern obstetric tools. Prolonged labor was often addressed by encouraging position changes, giving herbal teas or infusions to strengthen contractions, and applying warmth or massage to relax the mother. Sometimes prayers and ritual encouragement were intensified, both to calm the mother and reinforce communal focus. Breech presentations were particularly challenging. Midwives could attempt manual repositioning, if safe, or adjust the mother's posture to encourage rotation. If these methods failed, the midwife prepared for assisted delivery, using gravity and hands to guide the baby. Complete surgical intervention was rare, so survival often relied on skillful positioning, experience, and timing. Hemorrhage was addressed with both herbs and pressure. Certain plants were believed to reduce bleeding, sage or rue, and the midwife might use firm massage, binding, or hot compresses to support uterine contraction. Some chronic methods included dietary adjustments or rest to restore maternal strength. Midwives were trained to make quick decisions. The combination of tactile assessment, intuition, and inherited knowledge determined outcomes. While mortality remained high, skilled midwives significantly improved survival odds, using every tool available in their cultural and practical framework. The tools of medieval midwifery were sparse but essential. The birthing stool was the primary instrument for positioning and support, aiding gravity and facilitating delivery. Swaddling cloths were critical immediately after birth. They kept the infant warm, immobilized fragile limbs, and allowed mothers to recover while newborns were cared for. Knives and other cutting instruments were rarely used. A knife might be employed in emergencies, such as cutting the umbilical cord or addressing obstructed labor, but only as a last resort due to the extreme risk of infection and maternal injury. Instead, the midwife relied on hands, ropes, posture, and herbal remedies, using tools only when absolutely necessary. The minimalism of tools underscored the midwife's skill. Physical technique, judgment, and observation outweighed instruments, and every object was integrated into a holistic approach, combining practical, emotional, and spiritual care. The birthing chamber was a space charged with emotion. Fear, excitement, and anticipation mingled with relief and joy, and the midwife managed this energy as carefully as the labor itself. Older women offered reassurance and historical perspective. Younger women provided empathy and support. Ritualized chanting, prayer, and storytelling helped regulate tension, while laughter, tears, and whispered encouragement sustained morale. The emotional dynamic also reinforced hierarchy. The midwife's calm authority reassured the mother and structured the room, while attendants followed instructions, supported tasks, and mediated social expectations. This network of emotional labor was essential. In a time without modern anesthesia or intervention, morale directly influenced the mother's endurance, her body's response, and the ultimate outcome of birth.
In the medieval worldview, pain in childbirth was rarely understood purely as a biological or mechanical process. Rather, it was interpreted through the lens of Christian theology. The story of Eve in the book of Genesis provided a moral framework. Because of her disobedience in the Garden of Eden, God declared that women would bring forth children in sorrow, experiencing labor as a mixture of physical suffering and spiritual consequence. This belief permeated medieval culture, shaping attitudes toward pregnancy and birth for both mothers and midwives. Pain was seen as inevitable, even necessary, a rite of passage linking the mother to the biblical narrative of human fallibility.
It was a reminder that childbirth was more than a physiological event. It was an intersection of life, morality, and divine will. Mothers were encouraged to endure pain with patience, humility, and prayer, as suffering was often framed as redemptive. Spiritual instruction accompanied physical labor. Mothers were reminded to pray, bless the child, and meditate on the Virgin Mary, who herself had experienced the hardships of motherhood. This theological perspective also influenced how communities perceived complications. Prolonged labor, hemorrhage, or difficult births were not always interpreted solely in medical terms. They were sometimes considered divine tests, spiritual trials, or manifestations of sin. The community's approach was therefore twofold: practical intervention by midwives and spiritual consolation through prayer, ritual, and reassurance. Pain was normalized as an inseparable part of the human experience, giving birth a sacred dimension while simultaneously reinforcing social and religious norms. Women's acceptance of pain also had a pragmatic effect. By expecting suffering as inevitable, medieval mothers were psychologically prepared to endure long labors, making survival more likely. Midwives, aware of the theological framing, skillfully integrated this belief into their care. They validated the mother's experience, framing pain as part of the cosmic order, while offering practical strategies for management. In this way, the Christian interpretation of Eve's punishment created a context in which suffering was tolerated, anticipated, and ritualized, rather than feared as random or inexplicable. Despite its severity, medieval childbirth offered remarkably few effective measures for pain relief. Unlike modern medicine, which relies on pharmacology and anesthesia, medieval mothers depended almost entirely on physical, herbal, and ritual interventions to manage discomfort. There was no morphine, ether, epidural, or controlled sedation. The tools available were practical, sensory, and psychological. Physical comfort was paramount. Midwives used massage to soothe tense muscles in the back, thighs, and abdomen. Mothers were encouraged to change positions frequently, sitting, kneeling, squatting, or leaning over the birthing stool to maximize pelvic alignment and ease contractions. Heat applied through warmed cloths, compresses, or herbal baths helped relax muscles and support circulation. Such interventions were non-invasive but provided tangible relief and facilitated labor. Herbal remedies also played a limited but important role. Teas or infusions of mint, chamomile, fennel, or lavender eased nausea, calmed the nerves, and offered a mild analgesic effect. Poultices or oils were applied topically to reduce local discomfort. These methods relied on observation and empirical knowledge. Midwives knew which plants worked best, in what dosage, and how to prepare them safely. While not sufficient to erase pain, these remedies helped mothers endure labor more effectively. Finally, distraction and ritual were employed as psychological coping mechanisms. Breathing guidance, prayers, chanting, and song occupied the mother's mind, helping her focus away from physical suffering. Emotional support from relatives and neighbors created a communal buffer against panic. In effect, pain relief in the medieval period was holistic rather than pharmaceutical. It combined body, mind, and spirit to sustain the mother through labor.
Because pain was seen as both physical and spiritual, protective and soothing objects were integral to medieval childbirth. Charms, holy relics, medals, and whispered prayers served as both talismans and psychological aids. Their presence reflected a belief in divine intervention, spiritual protection, and the mediation of unseen forces. Charms varied by region and tradition. Simple knotted cords, small amulets,
or hand-carved stones might be placed beneath the mother's pillow or tied around her wrist. These objects were believed to shield the mother and child from harm, repel malevolent spirits, and promote safe passage through the trials of labor. Some were inscribed with religious symbols, crosses, saints' initials, or scripture verses to invoke protection. Holy relics played a similarly protective role. Fragments of saints' bones, pieces of cloth associated with the Virgin Mary, or small vials of consecrated oil were brought into the birthing chamber. Their presence was considered a tangible link to the divine, a conduit for miraculous intervention. Midwives and attendants handled these objects with reverence, placing them strategically near the bed or birthing stool. Saints' medals, particularly of Saint Margaret of Antioch, were widespread. Margaret was venerated as a protector of women in labor, famed for surviving the threat of a dragon in her legend, a symbol of the dangers inherent in childbirth. Mothers or midwives might hold these medals, kiss them, or whisper prayers over them as contractions intensified. Such rituals offered comfort, focus, and hope, reinforcing both spiritual and psychological resilience. Together, charms, relics, medals, and prayers exemplify the inseparability of the physical and spiritual in medieval childbirth. They were tools of protection, tools of faith, and tools of psychological endurance, integral to the experience of labor in a world without modern medicine. The moment of birth was the climax of the labor process, and the medieval midwife's role became most crucial here. With no modern obstetric equipment, she relied entirely on experience, instinct, and careful observation to ensure the safe arrival of the newborn. When the infant emerged, the midwife's hands were the first to receive and stabilize it. Catching a baby required anticipation and precision. The midwife had to judge the speed of delivery, the alignment of the infant's head and shoulders, and the momentum of the body. A firm but gentle grip prevented the child from slipping or sustaining injury, while also avoiding unnecessary pressure on the delicate skull. In upright or squatting births, the midwife often knelt on the floor or positioned herself beneath the birthing stool to be in the optimal position for catching. The midwife's focus was absolute. Every movement was purposeful, guiding the shoulders through the birth canal, supporting the neck, and cradling the body as it slid free. Her hands, conditioned by years of apprenticeship, knew exactly how to absorb the weight of the infant, protect vulnerable joints, and prevent tearing or trauma. Surrounding women assisted silently, adjusting blankets, keeping the space clear, and preparing for the next steps. In this moment, the entire birthing chamber shifted its attention. Silence, whispered prayers, and steady breathing surrounded the mother and infant. The act of catching a newborn was as much a ritual of skill and authority as it was a life-saving procedure, marking the transition from the uncertain process of labor to the first seconds of a new life in the medieval village. Once the infant was safely delivered, the midwife's attention turned to the child's airway. Clearing the mouth and nose was critical, as fluid or mucus could impede breathing and lead to suffocation. Midwives relied on a combination of fingers, cloths, and experience rather than suction devices. Clean linen or soft cloths were prepared in advance. The midwife would gently wipe away mucus and amniotic fluid, carefully avoiding irritation or injury to the delicate facial tissues. Fingers, often lubricated with clean oil or water, might be used to clear the nose or mouth if blockages persisted. This task required dexterity and a steady hand, as even slight pressure could harm the infant's sensitive membranes. Timing was crucial. Clearing was done immediately after delivery, before swaddling or movement, and often repeated if the baby struggled to breathe. The midwife relied on cues such as color, crying, and spontaneous movement
to judge the effectiveness of her intervention. The community of women in the room watched closely, ready to assist by bringing warm cloths, additional towels, or herbs for comfort. This process reflected both medical knowledge and ritualized care. In a world without oxygen masks, mechanical suction, or neonatal technology, survival depended entirely on the midwife's experience, intuition, and steady hands. Clearing the airway was as much a testament to human skill as it was a vital first step in ensuring the infant's life.
After the newborn was breathing and stabilized, attention turned to the umbilical cord. In medieval Europe, the cord was usually tied and cut quickly after birth, a task entrusted exclusively to the midwife. Clean thread, string, or sometimes thin strips of cloth were used to ligate the cord in two places, one knot near the infant and one near the placenta. Cutting was performed with small knives or scissors, reserved for trained hands to prevent injury or infection. The procedure required caution. A misplaced cut could endanger the infant, the mother, or both. The midwife's experience guided the process. She understood the importance of maintaining proper tension, keeping the cord sterile, and minimizing trauma to the fragile tissues. Cord care was also symbolic. Tying and cutting represented the infant's separation from the mother's body and the first act of independent life. Some communities incorporated ritual elements. Prayers, blessings, or charms were placed near the cord to ensure protection and longevity. The procedure was quick but deliberate, reflecting the blend of practical necessity, skill, and spiritual care that characterized medieval midwifery. After the cord was secured, the midwife assessed the newborn's vitality. Immediate signs of life, crying, spontaneous movement, and healthy coloration were observed carefully. A robust cry indicated that the lungs were functioning. Movement suggested healthy muscle tone. A pink or ruddy skin color signaled adequate circulation. Midwives were trained to detect subtle differences. Weak or irregular breathing might indicate distress, while pale or bluish skin could signal oxygen deprivation or other complications. This assessment guided subsequent care. Additional warmth, rubbing, or stimulation could be administered, and urgent intervention could be initiated if necessary. The mother, often exhausted, watched anxiously. The midwife's calm and authoritative assessment reassured her that her child was alive and well. In some cases, assistance helped by lifting blankets, applying gentle pressure, or offering supportive herbs or oils to stabilize the infant. This step exemplified the midwife's dual role as both clinician and community mediator, ensuring the child's survival while managing the mother's anxiety and the household's expectations. If the newborn struggled to breathe or remained lethargic, the midwife had a range of techniques to stimulate vitality. Rubbing the limbs and back with warm hands or cloths was common, intended to stimulate circulation and encourage reflexive movement. Warmth played a vital role. Cold infants were more likely to experience respiratory distress, so heated linen or warmed hands were carefully applied. Herbal smoke was another traditional intervention. Certain herbs like rosemary, rue, or lavender were burned, and the fragrant smoke wafted over the infant. This was believed to both purify the environment and stimulate life. Chanting, recitation of psalms, or whispered prayers accompanied these measures. These rituals had psychological as well as perceived physiological effects. They focused the attention of the midwife and attendants, creating a structured response to crisis. Such interventions required experience and finesse. Excessive rubbing could injure soft tissue. Too much smoke could irritate the lungs. Poorly timed prayers might distract from practical action. Skilled midwives balanced touch, ritual, and observation,
often saving infants that might otherwise have failed to survive. In this way, medieval neonatal care combined practical skill with spiritual and sensory methods in a holistic framework. Once the newborn was stabilized and swaddled, the midwife's attention turned to the placenta, the organ that had sustained life in the womb but could now pose a serious risk if not expelled properly. In medieval childbirth, delivering the placenta was a crucial final stage of labor, one that could determine whether the mother survived. The placenta often delivered naturally within 10 to 30 minutes after birth, aided by mild contractions. The midwife might encourage gentle abdominal massage, guide the mother into upright or squatting positions, or apply warm compresses to the abdomen to stimulate uterine contraction. These actions were intended to help the organ detach and prevent hemorrhage. However, complications could arise. If the placenta remained retained, it could lead to dangerous bleeding, infection, or uterine collapse. Medieval midwives relied on experience, observation, and tactile skill to detect whether the placenta was separating correctly. In some cases, careful manual assistance was required. The midwife inserted gloved, lubricated fingers to guide detachment, always balancing effectiveness with the risk of injury or contamination. Documentation from the period shows that retained placenta was one of the leading causes of maternal death. While medieval medicine lacked antibiotics or surgical techniques, midwives developed practical strategies. They used herbs such as sage, rue, or yarrow to stimulate uterine contraction and reduce bleeding, applied pressure to the lower abdomen and maintained warmth. Prayers, chants, and ritual gestures were often added, blending the practical and spiritual in attempts to safeguard life.
After birth, postpartum bleeding was a normal but potentially dangerous phenomenon. In medieval Europe, excessive bleeding, postpartum hemorrhage, could quickly become fatal. Midwives were acutely aware of this risk, and managing it formed a central part of postpartum care. Herbal remedies were the primary tools for controlling bleeding. Rue, sage, yarrow, and comfrey were commonly applied, often as poultices, teas, or compresses, to stimulate uterine contraction and support clotting. These herbs were chosen based on empirical observation over generations. Midwives noted which plants effectively slowed bleeding and promoted maternal recovery. Heat, applied through warm cloths or compresses, further aided uterine contraction and circulation. Observation was constant. Midwives monitored the color and volume of blood, the mother's pulse, and her overall strength. If bleeding appeared excessive, attendants adjusted positions, applied pressure, and continued to encourage rest. Emotional support was equally important. Calm reassurance reduced maternal panic, which could exacerbate blood loss. Medieval communities understood that postpartum hemorrhage was a primary cause of maternal mortality. While herbal treatments were far from perfect, they represented the most effective interventions available. The midwife's skill in detecting early warning signs, combined with herbal knowledge and practical care, often made the difference between life and death. Feeding a newborn was another domain of complex social and cultural practice. Breastfeeding was encouraged, but norms varied widely based on region, class, and maternal health. In many rural communities, the mother breastfed her own child, sometimes from birth. However, if she was too weak, ill, or had another infant to care for, a wet nurse might be employed. Wet nurses were women who had recently given birth and could provide milk, often earning payment or barter in return. Colostrum, the first, nutrient-rich milk, was often treated with caution. Some traditions believed it was too strong or impure for the newborn, leading midwives to delay feeding or discard the earliest milk. Others recognized its health benefits and encouraged its administration. Early feeding practices also reflected humoral theory. Milk was believed to influence the child's temperament, balance of humors, and overall health. Feeding methods varied. Infants were sometimes fed directly from the breast, while others received expressed milk via a spoon or small vessel. Wet nurses often had guidelines regarding their diet, conduct, and hygiene, as these were thought to directly affect the quality of milk. The entire process was embedded in a network of observation, social negotiation, and medical belief, showing that nutrition was understood not just as sustenance, but as a carefully managed intervention in early life. After birth, the mother entered a period of confinement, known as lying in, which typically lasted from 1 to 4 weeks. This was a time of rest, recovery, and limited social interaction, structured to protect both mother and child. The practice was widespread across medieval Europe and reflected both practical and cultural reasoning. During lying in, the mother remained in bed or designated chamber, attended continuously by female relatives, neighbors, or the midwife. Movement was restricted to prevent strain on the body, particularly the uterus, which was still contracting and bleeding. The bed or birthing area was often lined with fresh straw or blankets, and warmth was maintained to reduce exposure to cold, drafts, or infection. Lying in was also a period of observation. Midwives monitored bleeding, infection signs, and maternal strength. They ensured adequate nutrition, provided herbal teas or restorative broths, and advised mothers on posture and gentle exercises to aid recovery. This period allowed the body to heal and minimized the risks of postpartum complications, which were significant in a time without modern medicine. Socially and spiritually, lying in was a protective ritual. Visitors were often limited, and prayers or blessings were recited for the health of mother and child. The practice reinforced the perception of childbirth as a vulnerable, sacred time, requiring concentrated attention and care from the female community.
During the lying-in period, the mother was not alone. A female community, often composed of midwives, relatives, neighbors, or other experienced women, attended to her every need. This care was multifaceted, practical, emotional, and ritualistic. Practical support included preparing meals, bringing herbs or medicinal concoctions, changing linens, and assisting with hygiene. Midwives checked the mother's bleeding, massage therapy, and diet, while experienced women provided guidance based on observation and oral tradition. Emotional care was equally critical. Birth was exhausting and traumatic, and the mother required reassurance, companionship, and encouragement. These women offered comfort, shared stories, and helped normalize the mother's experience. Ritual support reinforced spiritual protection. The attending women might recite prayers, bless the mother and infant, or perform small symbolic gestures to ward off evil spirits. This communal presence reflected the medieval understanding that birth and recovery were inherently social processes. Survival depended not only on the mother's body, but on the attentiveness, skill, and solidarity of the women around her. During confinement, mothers faced strict restrictions designed to protect health and promote recovery. Movement was limited. Mothers were encouraged to remain in bed or seated in a supported position to prevent strain on the uterus and bleeding sites. Gentle exercises might be allowed, but lifting, bending, or walking long distances was discouraged. Diet was carefully monitored. Foods were chosen according to humoral theory. Warm, nourishing meals were preferred, often including broths, grains, and herbal teas. Cold, raw, or wet foods were avoided, as they were thought to disrupt the balance of humors or slow healing.
Hydration and nutrient intake were prioritized to support milk production and overall recovery. Sexual activity was strictly prohibited during lying in, often for several weeks, both for physiological recovery and moral considerations. Some traditions held that early sexual activity could endanger the mother, weaken milk production, or invite spiritual harm. These restrictions reinforced the perception of postpartum vulnerability, emphasizing that the period after birth was one of intense protection, care, and observation. By combining limitations on movement, diet, and sexual activity, medieval societies structured a controlled environment to maximize maternal and infant survival. These customs reflected a combination of practical knowledge, religious belief, and social norms, ensuring that the mother emerged from confinement healthier, safer, and spiritually fortified. In medieval Europe, infant mortality was extremely high, and the fear of a newborn dying before receiving the sacrament of baptism profoundly shaped societal practices. The Church taught that unbaptized souls could not enter heaven, leaving both families and clergy anxious about the child's spiritual fate. Consequently, rapid baptism became common, often performed within hours of birth and sometimes on the same day. This urgency was not simply religious ritual, it was a social and emotional necessity. Families, midwives, and neighbors recognized the fragility of neonatal life. Illness, congenital complications, or exposure could claim a child quickly. Baptism, therefore, was both a spiritual safeguard and a practical reassurance that the child's soul would be protected even if the body did not survive. The timing of baptism could dictate the entire postnatal routine. Midwives prepared the infant immediately after birth, drying and warming the baby, swaddling briefly, and ensuring it was clean enough for sacramental contact. Parents, aware of mortality risks, often organized the ceremony in advance, holy water ready, clergy on notice, and godparents prepared. This practice highlights how intertwined birth, life expectancy, and faith were, shaping not only the child's first hours, but the structure of maternal and community care around delivery. Given the unpredictability of infant survival, the Church granted midwives authority to perform emergency baptisms in the absence of a priest. This power reflected both the urgency of spiritual protection and the practical realities of rural or isolated life, where clergy could be miles away. Midwives, who were already trusted caregivers, were considered morally and spiritually reliable for this task. They used water, often consecrated if available, and spoke the baptismal formula, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." This act was recognized by the Church as valid if performed out of necessity, even though midwives were not ordained clergy. Emergency baptism often involved additional ritual safeguards. The midwife might bless the water, trace a cross on the child's forehead, or whisper prayers for protection. In some communities, families kept small bottles of holy water ready precisely for this purpose. This dual role of the midwife as physical caretaker and spiritual agent demonstrates the medieval understanding that birth was not only a medical event, but a deeply religious and social process, where survival of both body and soul depended on skill, timing, and faith.
After the emergency or rapid baptism, formal church rituals and social conventions structured the infant's integration into the spiritual and communal world. Naming customs were tightly regulated, often honoring saints, ancestors, or local traditions. Choosing a name was more than a symbolic act. It invoked divine protection, aligned the child with moral exemplars, and reinforced familial and community identity. Godparents were carefully selected for their spiritual reliability and social status. They were expected to guide the child's moral and religious education and offer protection against spiritual dangers. In some regions, multiple godparents were chosen,
reflecting both social alliances and spiritual oversight. Their presence reinforced communal responsibility. The child's survival and virtue were shared duties, not solely the mother's or midwife's concern. Baptism ceremonies were often brief but highly charged events. Water, prayers, and holy oils sanctified the child. Chants and blessings invoked divine oversight. Even in humble villages, these rituals marked the transition from physical survival to spiritual community membership. Families and midwives understood the ceremony as protective, ensuring that if the child were to die, it would do so in the grace of the church, while also providing long-term spiritual support for the child who survived. Fear of unbaptized infants extended beyond theology into folklore and superstition. Unbaptized children were often considered spiritually vulnerable, at risk of wandering as restless spirits or being denied entrance to heaven. Tales abounded of souls trapped in liminal spaces, wandering the earth or haunting households. Such beliefs reinforced the urgency of baptism and emphasized the moral responsibility of families and midwives. These superstitions influenced behavior throughout the early postnatal period. Parents might avoid exposing unbaptized infants to strangers, ensure constant supervision, or carry charms in addition to seeking sacramental protection. Midwives reinforced these practices, blending medical, social, and spiritual guidance. In some communities, unbaptized infants were given temporary names or nicknames to prevent evil spirits from recognizing them, a practice that highlights the interplay between fear, ritual, and survival in medieval birth culture. Overall, the combination of rapid baptism, emergency authorization for midwives, formal naming and godparent selection, and pervasive superstition shows that spiritual survival was inseparable from physical survival. The newborn's first hours were a carefully managed intersection of faith, practical care, and communal ritual, reflecting the medieval worldview that life and soul were equally precious and precarious. In medieval society, the birth of a child carried different social meanings depending on class, but for noble families, it was often a matter of dynastic survival. Nobility was built on land, titles, and alliances, all of which were inherited through male heirs in many regions. A son ensured the continuation of the family name, the security of estates, and the perpetuation of political and economic influence. The arrival of an heir was celebrated not only privately but publicly. Lords and ladies might organize feasts, announce the birth to neighboring families, and even issue tokens or gifts to affirm the continuity of their lineage. The event was deeply intertwined with strategy, securing alliances through marriages, legitimizing claims to property, and reinforcing the family's social and political status. Beyond political utility, noble families also invested significant resources in the care of the mother and child. Experienced midwives, wet nurses, and attendants were summoned, often traveling from distant regions to ensure the birth proceeded smoothly. Herbs, warm rooms, ritual prayers, and charms were applied meticulously, reflecting the stakes. The death of a newborn heir could have profound social, financial, and political repercussions. Moreover, the expectation of heirs placed tremendous pressure on noble women. They were valued not only as mothers, but as instruments for securing the family's future. Failed pregnancies or the absence of male heirs could threaten their social standing. This dynamic highlights the intersection of family, gender, and societal structure in medieval birth culture. Childbirth was not merely a personal or private event, but a central element of the feudal system. For peasant families, the stakes were different but no less significant. A newborn represented the future workforce, the child who would eventually contribute to farm labor, household tasks, and community survival. Each child was a potential helper in planting, harvesting, tending animals, or assisting in domestic chores, making their survival vital to the economic continuity of the household.
Unlike noble families, peasants could not rely on surplus wealth or extensive support networks. Midwives came from nearby villages, and the mother's health directly affected the household's productivity. Herbs, meals, and rest were vital, not just for survival, but to ensure that the mother could recover and continue her work. The success of childbirth had practical consequences. A healthy infant meant additional labor and economic security, whereas infant death could compromise the family's future well-being. The arrival of a new child carried symbolic and social weight. Villagers often marked the birth with small communal rituals, sharing bread, butter, or ale, and assisting in maternal recovery. Even modest celebrations reinforced bonds between families and neighbors, emphasizing that childbirth was both a personal and collective concern. In peasant society, the survival of the next generation was critical for maintaining the family's livelihood and sustaining the broader community network.
Whether noble or peasant, successful births were celebrated communally. The act of bringing a child into the world was seen not only as a personal triumph, but as a communal achievement. In noble households, feasts, announcements, and gifts affirmed social status, alliance networks, and succession plans. In peasant communities, celebrations were simpler but equally significant. Neighbors visited, shared meals, and provided practical support for the mother and child. Rituals accompanied these celebrations. Naming ceremonies, blessings, and informal christenings often involved prayers, small offerings, or the use of charms to ensure protection and long-term health. Feasts could range from a modest gathering with bread and ale to more elaborate events marking the continuation of a family line. Gifts of food, clothing, or animals might be offered to support the mother and help integrate the child into the household. Celebration also reinforced social cohesion. Communities collectively acknowledged the risk and labor involved in childbirth, recognized the skill of midwives, and reaffirmed mutual dependence. The joy of a successful birth was not simply a private emotion, it was woven into the social fabric, strengthening bonds, transmitting cultural values, and demonstrating the intersection of personal life with communal responsibility. Despite celebrations, infant mortality cast a shadow over every birth. Medieval Europe had extremely high rates of neonatal death. In some regions, as many as 1/3 of children died before the age of 5. Families learned early to temper joy with caution, and communities approached births with both hope and apprehension. The contrast between jubilation and grief was stark. A healthy newborn might inspire feasts, prayers, and communal laughter, while a death, even hours after birth, brought mourning, ritual lamentation, and spiritual concern. Midwives, mothers, and communities were intimately aware of the fragility of life, and this awareness shaped behavior. Rapid baptism, constant observation, and protective rituals were all motivated by the possibility of loss. Grief was expressed communally. Funerals for infants were brief but solemn. Prayers, blessings, and sometimes symbolic burials acknowledged both the child's death and the family's pain. Stories and oral traditions emphasized the precariousness of life, teaching caution, humility, and the value of each successful birth. At the same time, the persistence of hope was equally vital. Each newborn was a chance for continuity of family, labor, lineage, and social networks. Communities balanced their sorrow with celebration, recognizing that the cycle of life and death was central to existence in the medieval period. This duality, the joy of survival and the shadow of potential loss,
permeated every aspect of childbirth, influencing care, ritual, and the emotional landscape of families and villages alike. Maternal mortality was a constant threat in medieval childbirth. Women faced numerous physiological dangers, many of which were poorly understood at the time. Among the most common causes were postpartum fever, hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor, each posing a grave risk to the mother's survival. Postpartum fever often resulted from unsanitary conditions during birth or from lingering infection in the uterus. Without knowledge of germs, midwives relied on observation and traditional practices to reduce risk. Clean linens, warm compresses, herbal washes, and restriction of exposure to drafts or contaminated water. While these measures were partially effective, fever remained a leading cause of maternal death. Hemorrhage, either during or after labor, was particularly dangerous. Retained placenta, torn tissue, or weakened uterine contraction could cause rapid and life-threatening blood loss. Midwives employed herbal remedies such as sage, rue, and yarrow, combined with massage and abdominal pressure to stimulate contraction and reduce bleeding. Timing was critical. Early recognition and intervention often determined whether the mother survived. Infection, sometimes referred to as childbed fever, could result from handling by multiple attendants, contaminated instruments, or exposure to unclean straw, water, or cloths. The concept of bacteria was unknown, but empirical knowledge dictated that cleanliness, warm compresses, and restricted contact could improve outcomes. Obstructed labor, including malpresentation or disproportion between mother and infant, posed life-threatening complications. Midwives relied on positioning, manual manipulation, and gravity to facilitate delivery, but in severe cases, survival was uncertain. In extreme circumstances, emergency measures like cutting or manipulating the infant were used, though they were risky. Maternal mortality was a harsh reality, shaping every aspect of childbirth. Families, midwives, and communities approached birth with vigilance, ritual, and practical preparation, understanding that the dangers were both physical and social. The death of a mother threatened not only a family's survival, but the economic and social stability of the household and village.
Infant mortality was equally pervasive and emotionally devastating. Studies suggest that in some medieval regions, up to 1/3 of children died before reaching 5 years of age, with a large proportion dying within the first weeks of life. This grim reality created a culture of cautious hope. Every newborn was celebrated, but families tempered joy with awareness of the fragility of life. Everyday life was shaped by this grief. Mothers, midwives, and extended family members developed rituals and routines designed to protect infants, from swaddling and herbal infusions to prayers, charms, and rapid baptism. Yet, despite these measures, loss was common. Villagers shared grief communally, often burying infants quickly, holding small memorials, or reciting prayers to ensure the child's soul found peace. The omnipresence of death also influenced social behavior. Families planned for multiple children, understanding that some might not survive. Emotional bonds were formed cautiously. Intense attachment developed gradually as survival became more likely, a psychological adaptation to frequent loss. Midwives were central in navigating these realities, offering not only practical care but emotional support, helping families cope with grief while preparing for the next birth. Midwives were often the first witnesses to the tragic outcomes of stillbirths, miscarriages, or congenital deformities.
Their responses combined practical management, spiritual ritual, and emotional support. For stillbirths, the midwife ensured safe removal of the infant from the birth canal, monitored the mother for bleeding or infection, and performed cleansing rituals. The body was often quickly washed, wrapped, and buried according to local customs, sometimes with prayers or blessings. Families were guided in mourning practices, balancing sorrow with the understanding that stillbirth was not necessarily a moral failure, but a natural tragedy. Miscarriages, whether early or late, were similarly managed. Midwives provided herbal remedies believed to aid uterine contraction, managed bleeding, and monitored the mother's health. Emotional care was critical, as miscarriages could cause deep social and spiritual anxiety. Rituals often involved blessings, prayers, and offerings to saints to protect future pregnancies. Deformities presented another challenge. Infants born with visible malformations were often met with a mixture of fear, superstition, and care. Some communities viewed deformities as signs of divine judgment, while others treated them with compassion, applying gentle care, warmth, and prayer. Midwives played a delicate role, balancing communal beliefs with the infant's immediate welfare, and often providing advice or guidance to parents on how to integrate the child into family life, or, in tragic cases, manage grief. The Church's teachings deeply influenced how families and midwives understood infant mortality. Infants who died unbaptized were believed to be in spiritual limbo. Medieval theology suggested that their souls could not enter heaven, but might not be condemned to eternal damnation. Concepts like limbo emerged to explain this uncertain fate, emphasizing the importance of rapid baptism. This belief shaped every aspect of postnatal care. Midwives were empowered to perform emergency baptisms when priests were unavailable, and families often prepared for the sacrament in advance. Religious rituals were applied even to infants who died shortly after birth, including blessings, prayers, and symbolic rites to protect the soul. The Church's teachings provided both moral guidance and emotional framework. Families were reassured that their efforts, baptism, prayer, and ritual, could secure spiritual protection. Yet these beliefs also intensified anxiety. The death of an unbaptized child was not only a personal tragedy, but a perceived spiritual crisis, prompting urgent communal response and deep emotional strain. Medieval societies codified responses to death in childbirth through both legal and customary practices. Maternal or infant death often triggered obligations for burial, inheritance, and ritual observance. For mothers who died during labor, communities observed specific funeral rites. Noble estates might involve heralds, feasts, and formal mourning, while peasant families relied on local clergy and neighbors to manage the body and provide spiritual care. Inheritance laws often dictated that estates and land pass quickly to the next heir, sometimes even before burial, reflecting the practical consequences of maternal mortality. For infants, burial customs varied by region and social class, but were often rapid and modest. Churchyards were common resting places, and blessings or prayers were recited to ensure spiritual protection. Naming, baptism, and ritual washing were central to the process, even if death occurred immediately after birth. Some communities placed emphasis on marking graves with stones, crosses, or small tokens to honor the child and provide a locus for mourning. Customs also extended to support for the bereaved family. Villagers offered food, labor, or emotional assistance during periods of grief. Midwives and female relatives played an essential role, guiding the family through practical steps, offering counsel, and ensuring that surviving children and mothers were protected. These laws and customs reflect the integration of practical, legal, spiritual, and emotional frameworks in medieval childbirth. Death was a constant risk, yet communities developed structured responses that balanced survival, ritual, and moral care. Midwives in medieval Europe occupied a paradoxical position. On one hand, they were highly respected for their essential role in bringing children safely into the world. Skilled midwives, especially those with years of experience, were celebrated in communities as lifesavers. Their knowledge of herbs, positioning, rituals, and practical care could mean the difference between life and death for mother and infant. Villagers often relied on the same midwife for generations, trusting her hands, judgment, and intuition implicitly. On the other hand, midwives were sometimes feared. Their expertise in anatomy, herbs, and reproductive processes, knowledge largely inaccessible to men outside clergy or physicians, led to suspicion. In a deeply religious and superstitious society, mastery over birth, life, and death could be perceived as dangerous or even occult. Some midwives were accused of witchcraft, especially if a birth went poorly, if infants or mothers died, or if the midwife's herbal remedies had unintended consequences. The tension between admiration and fear shaped midwives' daily lives. They navigated complex social expectations. They were caregivers, spiritual guides, and arbiters of life, while also under scrutiny from neighbors, clergy, and authorities. Their work demanded discretion, skill, and moral authority, reinforcing their status while keeping them vulnerable to rumor and accusation. This duality reflects the precarious position of women wielding specialized knowledge in a patriarchal, religiously regulated society. As cities grew in the late medieval period, midwives began to organize into guilds or informal associations. These guilds provided several functions. They standardized training, shared best practices, and offered protection against accusations or competition. Membership in a guild could elevate a midwife's social standing, providing legal recognition and access to networks of apprentices and resources. Guilds also created codes of conduct, establishing responsibilities for care, acceptable remedies, and ethical behavior. They sometimes regulated fees, ensured members had sufficient practical experience, and required observation by senior midwives before one could practice independently. These organizations reflected urbanization and the increasing complexity of healthcare in growing populations where more births and higher density of families demanded coordination and oversight. Guilds also helped defend midwives from accusations of malpractice or witchcraft. By demonstrating that members followed communal standards and were accountable to peers, midwives could claim legitimacy in disputes. These associations were early precursors to professional regulation, representing only a few ways women could wield recognized authority within the medical sphere during the medieval period. By the early modern period, the role of midwives began to shift dramatically with the rise of male physicians and surgeons in obstetrics. Increasingly, educated men began to assert authority over childbirth, bringing anatomical knowledge, surgical tools, and medical texts into domains historically dominated by women. This professionalization often marginalized midwives, especially in urban areas, while rural communities continued to rely on traditional female practitioners. Male physicians introduced interventions such as forceps, early surgical techniques, and experimental procedures. Their approach emphasized scientific theory, anatomical precision, and academic knowledge, complementing but also challenging the practical, experiential expertise of midwives. Licensing laws, guild regulations, and municipal ordinances increasingly favored formally trained men, restricting female midwives to subordinate roles in hospitals or parish communities. Despite these changes,
midwives retained critical influence, particularly in rural and peasant communities where male physicians were inaccessible. Their experiential knowledge, cultural familiarity, and spiritual guidance remained indispensable. The transition illustrates a broader shift in medical authority from communal female-centered care towards professionalized male-dominated medicine, blending scientific advances with social, religious, and gendered dynamics. The legacy of medieval midwives persisted. They laid the foundation for modern obstetrics, preserving centuries of empirical knowledge, herbal remedies, positioning techniques, and psychosocial care, even as the medical landscape evolved. Their work reflects a historical continuity between hands-on experience, communal trust, and the professionalization of healthcare that continues to influence birth practices today.
Childbirth in medieval Europe was not merely a private event. It was social, economic, and spiritual cornerstone that shaped communities at every level. From noble estates to rural villages, the survival of mothers and children directly influenced the continuity of families, the stability of labor forces, and the social cohesion of entire regions. Every birth carried weight. An heir preserved dynasties and political alliances. A peasant child ensured the next generation of laborers to maintain the household and village economy. In this sense, childbirth was the linchpin of medieval life, connecting private experience with public consequence. The stakes of birth extended into religion and morality. The Church's influence permeated every aspect of labor, from prayer and emergency baptism to rituals protecting mothers and infants from spiritual harm. The fear of unbaptized infants, the use of charms, and the constant invocation of saints reveal how faith shaped both daily practices and long-term survival strategies. These spiritual dimensions also reinforced social hierarchies. Noble families could summon multiple attendants and employ clergy, while rural communities relied on collective action, midwives, and neighbors to navigate both life and risk. Childbirth also shaped gender dynamics. Women dominated the birthing chamber, wielding authority and knowledge that men lacked, while simultaneously navigating patriarchal oversight, church doctrines, and societal expectations. The midwife's role became central not only to survival, but to the education of younger women, the transmission of practical knowledge, and the management of communal rituals surrounding birth and death. In this way, childbirth was a lens through which medieval society expressed its structure, values, and dependence on women's labor, both visible and invisible. The knowledge of medieval women, midwives, mothers, herbalists, and elder caregivers represents a rich but often overlooked legacy. These women preserved and transmitted empirical knowledge about pregnancy, labor, herbal medicine, infant care, and postpartum recovery. Skills were taught through apprenticeship, oral tradition, and hands-on practice rather than academic study, creating a lineage of expertise that ensured generations of survival. Yet this knowledge was undervalued and often marginalized in historical records. Male physicians, clergy, and chroniclers frequently dismissed midwives as untrained or superstitious, ignoring the empirical precision, observational rigor, and critical problem-solving that defined their practice. The reality is striking. The midwives' interventions, manual repositioning, herbal remedies, careful observation, emergency baptisms saved countless lives. Yet their stories were rarely preserved with the same attention as male scholars or medical texts. Despite this, their work shaped the cultural, spiritual, and medical landscape of medieval Europe. Women's knowledge mediated the dangerous realities of childbirth, guided ethical and religious practices, and provided emotional and communal support in the face of frequent loss.
Recognizing this legacy is essential to understanding both the history of medicine and the broader role of women in sustaining medieval life. The invisible labor of women, often passed down quietly through generations, remains one of the most critical yet underappreciated aspects of medieval society. As the story of medieval childbirth draws to a close, it becomes clear that the midwife's work was the axis around which birth, survival, and community revolved. Their labor was physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual, encompassing every stage of pregnancy, delivery, and postpartum care. Midwives guided mothers through pain, danger, and uncertainty, using hands, herbs, prayers, and skill to shepherd life into a precarious world. They taught, nurtured, and protected, often without recognition beyond the walls of the birthing chamber. The midwife's presence extended beyond individual births. She was a teacher to young women, a counselor to anxious mothers, a mediator between the material and spiritual realms, and a stabilizing figure in the fragile ecosystem of medieval family life. Communities depended on her, and yet she often remained invisible in written histories. Her labor recorded only in passing, her achievements attributed to divine providence or generalized luck rather than skill. Honoring these women requires seeing childbirth not only as a biological event, but as a cultural and social process, one in which midwives, mothers, and female communities played indispensable roles. Every swaddled infant, every emergency baptism, every ritual blessing speaks to centuries of accumulated knowledge and courageous labor. They were guardians of life in a world where mortality was constant and hope fragile. The narrative of medieval birth, therefore, is also a narrative of women's resilience, ingenuity, and communal care. By exploring their lives, we recognize the profound influence of midwives, whose labor shaped families, communities, and societies, and whose legacy persists in modern obstetrics, childcare practices, and women's knowledge today. Their work, though often invisible, forms the foundation upon which survival, social cohesion, and cultural continuity depended. In honoring them, we acknowledge that the story of life itself in the medieval world was written not only by chroniclers and priests, but by the skilled, compassionate, and tireless hands of midwives.